The wind did not just blow, it screamed. It was a high, thin sound that came off the peaks of the high basin, a noise that sounded like something dying in the dark. This was the Wyoming Territory. On the 30th night of December, in the year of 1888, the cold was a physical thing, a presence that sought to stop the heart. Snow did not fall. It flew sideways, sharp as ground glass, scouring the landscape clean in the vast, churning white. There was one light. It hung from the porch of Eli Mercer's cabin, a single kerosene lantern fighting a losing war against the storm. It bucked and swung wildly, casting frantic, elongated shadows that danced with the blizzard. Inside, Eli Mercer watched the light and listened to the wind. He was a man of 34 years, built solid, with the heavy shoulders and thick forearms of the blacksmith he had once been. Now, he was a homesteader, a man who had traded the fire of the forge for the silence of the valley. He lived alone, save for Flint, a hound so old his muzzle was white and his movements were stiff with memory. The cabin was small, but it was tight. It smelled of the dry pine crackling in the hearth, the coffee he had brewed hours ago, and the faint, permanent tang of hot iron that clung to Eli himself, a ghost of his former trade. Flint lay curled on the hearthstones, his ears twitching at the worst of the gusts. Eli sat at his small table, mending a piece of harness, his hands, scarred and sure, working the leather and thread. He was accustomed to the storm's voice. It was the only voice he heard most nights. Then came a sound that was not the wind. It was a sharp, percussive crack, followed by a heavy slam. Flint lifted his head, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Eli paused, his needle halfway through the leather. He listened. The wind howled, a rising crescendo, and then, through it, again. Thwack, slam, thwack, slam. It was the barn door. The heavy south door, the one he had built to withstand a bull. For that latch to have failed, the wind must have been tearing the world apart at its seams. He muttered a curse, not in anger, but in weary acceptance. His stock, the two mares in the gelding, would be terrified. He stood, his chair scraping on the plank floor. He pulled on his sheepskin-lined coat, the wool dense and heavy. He jammed his hat low over his brow, grabbed his thickest gloves, and lit the storm lantern, the heavy one, caged in brass. Flint whined, rising painfully to his feet, but Eli pointed to the hearth. "Stay, this is no night for old bones." Eli opened the cabin door. The storm lunged for him. The wind punched him in the chest, stealing his breath, plastering his shirt to his skin in an instant. The snow, which had seemed like a flurry from the window, was a solid, moving wall. He leaned his shoulder into the door to force it shut behind him, the latch clicking home like the bolt of a rifle. The 50 yards to the barn felt like a mile. The snow was not flat ground. It was a geography of its own, with drifts that came past his knees, forcing him to high step like a fool. He held the lantern low, its yellow light carving a small, frantic circle in the suffocating white. The wind tried to rip the lantern from his grip, the metal handle already burning cold through his glove. He heard the barn door before he saw it, the slamming now a frantic, splintering rhythm. It was swinging free on one hinge, beating itself to pieces against the frame. He reached it, his beard already crusted with ice. He fought the door, using his full weight to shove it inward, the wind trying to tear it from his hands. He finally got it open wide enough to slip inside, then threw his shoulder against it to close it. He fumbled for the spare rope he kept for this very purpose, lashing the door handle to the heavy mounting post. The barn was dark, filled with the smell of hay, horse, and the sharp ammonia of fear. The animals were restless, stamping and snorting in their stalls, their eyes wide and white in the shadows. "Easy," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Easy, now." He lifted the storm lantern, the small flame pushing the oppressive darkness back. The light swept over the stalls, over the tack hanging on the far wall, over the neat stacks of feed sacks, and then the light stopped. It had found something that did not belong. Against the far wall, half hidden behind a stack of empty grain sacks, was a shape, a heap of white, At first, he thought it was a snowdrift that had blasted in through some crack, but it was too contained, too solid. He walked closer, his boots crunching on the stray hay. The lantern light slid across the shape, and he saw fabric, satin, and lace. It was a person. He dropped to one knee. The lantern held high. It was a woman, curled into the tightest ball imaginable, as if trying to crawl back inside herself. She was wearing a dress, a white wedding dress. The delicate fabric was frozen stiff, brittle as sugar glass, shining with a crust of ice. Her head was tucked down, her hair, dark and wet, frozen in strands across her face. One hand was clutched tight around the handle of a small, soaked valise. The other was pressed against her chest. Her fingers were exposed. Eli sucked in a sharp breath. They were not red. They were a terrible, waxy purple, the color of ink and bruising. He lifted the lantern higher, bringing it close to her face. Her lips were blue, split down the middle, a dark, frozen bead of blood sealing them shut. Her eyelashes were miniature icicles. Around her neck, stark against the deathly pallor of her skin, was a simple ribbon of dark blue velvet. Eli's mind, which had stalled in disbelief, snapped back to the practical. He ripped off his heavy glove. He pressed two bare, calloused fingers against her neck, just under the jaw, searching for a pulse, for any sign of life in the frozen stillness. He felt nothing, only cold flesh, hard as marble. He pressed harder, his own heart hammering. The wind screamed outside, rattling the roof. Wait, he felt it, a flicker, a tremor so faint it was more a rumor than a pulse. It was weak, it was fading, but it was there. He did not waste another second. He was a man who understood heat and cold, life and metal. He knew this race. He ripped his own heavy wool cloak from his shoulders, the one that had kept him alive on the walk over. He unfolded it, a massive, smoky-smelling weight of wool, and wrapped it around her, dress and all. He did not try to straighten her limbs, fearing they might break. He bundled her as she was. He slid one arm under her back, the other under her knees. When he lifted, a small, choked gasp escaped him. She weighed nothing. She was a bundle of ice and bone. He kicked the rope door open, breaking the knot, and plunged back into the storm. The return was a blind fight. He carried her against his chest, her head tucked under his chin, trying to shield her with his own body. The wind tore at them, a living thing that wanted this small life he held. He could not see the cabin. He walked toward where he knew the light should be, his boots sinking deep, his thighs burning with the effort of each step. Flint was barking inside, a high, frantic sound. Eli hit the porch, his boot heel catching the step, and he nearly went down. He righted himself, turned his back to the wind, and kicked the cabin door open. He stumbled inside, the storm roaring in with him like a hungry wolf, and slammed the door shut with his heel. The sudden, roaring silence of the cabin was deafening. There was only the sound of the fire and his own ragged, painful breathing. He did not put her on the bed. He strode to the hearth and laid the bundle down on the thick bearskin rug, as close to the fire as he dared. Flint rushed forward, sniffing at the wool-wrapped shape, and then recoiled, whining low in his throat. Eli worked with a focused, desperate speed. He grabbed the poker and mercilessly jabbed the logs, breaking the char, sending a volcano of new sparks up the chimney. He threw two more heavy logs onto the grate. The fire roared, a hungry, life-giving sound. He knew better than to try and remove the frozen dress. It would be fused to her skin, and peeling it off would take the skin with it. Instead, he grabbed every blanket he owned, the heavy quilts from his cot, the spare horse blankets he kept clean, and piled them on top of her. He grabbed the soapstones he kept warming by the hearth, wrapped them in spare cloths, and slid them deep under the blanket mound, near her feet, at her back, near the frozen core of her. He ran to the stove, grabbed the kettle, and poured water into a cup. He let it cool until it was just lukewarm, not hot. He knelt beside her. He gently slid a hand under the cloak, finding her head. He lifted it. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough. "Ma'am, you need to drink. Just a sip." He brought the tin cup to her split lips. The first drops just spilled over her chin, freezing again on contact with the air. "Come on," he whispered, his voice urgent. He tipped the cup again, forcing a small trickle between her teeth. A faint, spastic movement in her throat. A swallow. It was another victory. He worked on her hands. He pulled the bundle open just enough to find them, still clutched together. He gently pried them apart. He pulled off his own gloves and took her waxy, purple hands between his own. They were massive, calloused, scarred from 1,000 burns and hammer blows. They were full of his own life, his own heat. He chafed her hands, breathing his own hot breath onto the frozen fingers, forcing the blood to move. He did the same for her feet. He found them under the frozen satin of her dress, pulling off the ruined, paper-thin slippers. Her feet were blocks of ice. He wrapped them in dry wool socks and rubbed them, his thumbs pressing hard, fighting the frost. He did not know how long he worked. The clock on the mantel ticked away 1 hour, then 2. The storm outside raged, but inside, the cabin was a fortress of heat. Slowly, agonizingly, the life returned. Her breathing, which had been a shallow whisper, became a shuddering rasp. A violent shiver seized her entire body, rattling her under the blankets. It was a good sign. It meant she was fighting. The color of her skin changed from waxy purple to a painful, blotchy red. He was adjusting the blankets, trying to keep her covered as she shivered. When his hand brushed against her left, his fingers hit the cold metal. He looked down. A ring, a simple, brand-new wedding band of bright yellow gold. It gleamed in the firelight. He frowned, and his eyes scanned her again. Tucked into the bodice of her dress, just above the blue ribbon, was a small, damp piece of cardstock. A luggage tag. Perhaps. It was stuck to the fabric. He worked it free with extreme care, his thick fingers clumsy on the delicate item. He brought it closer to the lantern light. The ink was blurred from the snow, but the hand that wrote it was neat. Cora Ellison. Below it, 2 words, Laramie Depot. As if the speaking of her name had called her back, the woman's eyes snapped open. They were blue, clouded with terror and a profound, agonizing confusion. She saw the low-beamed ceiling, the fire, and then she saw him, this huge, bearded stranger, looming over her in the firelight. A choked, terrified sound escaped her. She tried to move, tried to scramble away, but her limbs would not obey. "You are safe," Eli said, keeping his voice low and calm. He held his hands up, open, showing they meant no harm. "You are safe. My name is Eli Mercer. You were in my barn. You were freezing." Her eyes darted around the room. She saw the door, barred shut. She saw the old dog watching her. She saw the rifle mounted over the mantel. The terror did not fade. Her lips, cracked and swollen, moved. She spoke, but only a dry rasp came out. He leaned closer, holding the cup of water. "It's all right. You're safe." She tried again, her voice a fragile whisper, broken by the shivers that still racked her. "Don't send me back," she breathed, her eyes locking on his, pleading, "Please, don't send me back to him." She did not say who him was. Looking at the new ring and the frozen wedding dress, Eli knew he did not have to ask. Her eyes rolled back, and she fell into the deep, dark sleep of pure exhaustion. The sleep of a body that had faced death and barely won. Eli Mercer sat back on his heels. He looked at the small, broken woman lying on his hearth. He looked at the door, barred against the blizzard. He had shut the storm out, but he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that he had just brought a much more dangerous one inside. The light in the cabin changed. It shifted from the warm, dancing yellow of the fire to a flat, heavy gray. Dawn had come to the high basin, not as a sunrise, but as a slow lifting of the dark. The blizzard had passed, moving east to torment other souls, and in its wake, it had left a world buried in a profound, suffocating silence. Eli Mercer was still in his chair by the hearth. He had not slept. He had spent the long hours of the morning, From 3 o'clock onward, listening. He listened to the dying voice of the wind as it retreated up the mountains, and he listened to the breathing of the woman on his floor. It had evened out, become the deep, regular breath of true sleep, not the shallow, frantic gasps of the night before. A sound broke the quiet, not from the outside world, but from the hearth. A sharp, terrified intake of air. Cora was awake. Her eyes snapped open, wide and animal bright with panic. She was staring at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, dark with smoke and age. This was not the Laramie Hotel. This was not the opulent, cold bedroom of the Voss Ranch. She did not know this place. She tried to sit up, a movement of pure, reflexive fear, but her body screamed in protest. Every muscle felt as if it had been beaten with stones. Every joint ached, a deep, burning throb as the last of the lethal cold was driven out. She was wrapped in heavy wool, layers of it, and she was warm. The warmth itself was disorienting. Her hands flew up, a bird-like, frantic motion. First to her throat. Her swollen fingers fumbled, then closed around the thin strip of velvet, the ribbon. It was still there. A small, shuddering sigh escaped her. Then, realizing she was in a stranger's blankets, in a stranger's room, her hands dropped immediately, crossing instinctively over her chest, a gesture of defense, a shielding of the self. Her eyes darted from the ceiling and found him. He was a large, shadowed figure in the dim morning light, sitting in a simple wooden chair. His beard was dark, his face set in lines she could not read. He was just watching her. Cora flinched, pulling the heavy blankets tighter, her whole body tensing for a blow, for a voice, for a demand. Eli saw the terror that flashed across her face. He did not move from his chair. He knew his size was an intimidation, and he made himself smaller, calmer. He kept his voice low, the same deep, steady rumble he used to soothe a spooked mare. "Easy, ma'am. You're safe." He held up his hands, palms open, just as he had the night before. A gesture of peace. "My name is Eli Mercer," he said, speaking slowly. "This is my cabin. I found you in my barn late last night. You were near frozen to death." Cora stared at him. Her mind was a fog, trying to piece together the fragmented memories. The ice, the wind, the slamming door, the darkness of the barn. And then this man, his face illuminated by a lantern, his voice cutting through the storm. "The storm?" she whispered. Her throat felt like she had swallowed sand and broken glass. It broke about an hour past midnight. Eli said. He still did not move closer. He gave her a deliberate, respectful space of 10 feet. "You're safe here. I mean you no harm. I will not ask you a single question you are not ready to answer." To prove his point, he turned his attention away from her, breaking the intense gaze. He picked up the iron poker and methodically stoked the fire, rearranging the logs to build the heat back up. "There is coffee on the stove," he said, his back partially to her. "And I made some broth. You should have that when you feel steady." The simple, domestic words did more to calm her panic than any protestation of safety. He was not looming over her. He was not demanding. He was building the fire and speaking of coffee. She slowly, painfully, pushed herself into a sitting position. The heavy blankets pooled around her waist. She looked down and saw she was wearing a man's thick wool undershirt. It was far too large for her. The sleeves rolled up half a dozen times, but it was clean and dry and wonderfully warm. He must have undressed her. A hot flush of shame rose up her neck, but the pragmatic part of her, the part that had survived, quickly stifled it. The wedding dress had been a casing of ice. He had done it to save her life, not to shame her. He had saved her modesty, too, by dressing her in this. Her own frozen dress was nowhere to be seen. He had likely burned it in the hearth, an offering to the fire that had saved her. She sat there, absorbing the heat, watching him. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion. He was not a man of wasted gestures. He poured the broth from a small pot into a tin cup and brought it to her. He did not crowd her. He set it down on the hearthstone. just within her reach, and then stepped back. She took it with both hands. Her fingers were swollen and bright red. The knuckles painful, but they worked. She lifted the cup and drank. The hot, salty liquid was the most profound comfort she had ever known. It was life. It spread warmth down to her very core. After she finished the cup, she set it down. The silence returned, filled only by the crackle of the new flames and the heavy thud of Eli's old hound, Flint, moving to lie closer to her. "He will be looking for me," she said at last, her voice stronger. Eli, who had been measuring coffee grounds into the pot, stopped. "Who, ma'am?" The story came out. Not all at once, but in painful, broken pieces, like fragments of ice. Her name was Cora Ellison. She was from a small parish in Missouri. Her father, a minister, had died 2 years prior, leaving her and her mother with a congregation that could not support them and debts they could not pay. The mail-order bride advertisement in the Matrimonial Monitor had seemed like a deliverance. A wealthy rancher in the Wyoming Territory, seeking a respectable wife to manage his household, a man of property. "The name," she said, her voice dropping, "was Logan Voss." Eli's hand, which was holding the coffee pot, tightened. The name landed in the quiet cabin like a heavy stone dropped on thin ice. He knew it. Every settler in the high basin knew that name, Logan Voss, a man who owned the land, the cattle, the water, and Eli was beginning to suspect the law. "I arrived in Laramie 2 days ago," Cora continued, her eyes fixed on the fire, seeing not the flames, but the memory. "He met me at the depot. He seemed polite. He was dressed in fine clothes. He was cold, but I mistook it for seriousness. We were married by the justice of the peace yesterday morning." She paused, her breathing hitching. She unconsciously touched the blue ribbon at her neck. "We went back to his ranch. It is not a home, it is a fortress, so large, it shadows the valley. He hosted a dinner. His men were there. They were loud. They drank. He drank. Later," she said, her voice becoming thin, "we were in the bedroom. He began to ask me questions about my past. I told him I had nothing to hide. I had a letter." She looked around frantically, her eyes wide. "My valise." "It's by the door, drying," Eli said quietly. It was frozen solid. "I had a letter of honor," she said, nodding, her focus returning. "From my pastor in Missouri, my father's replacement. It vouched for my character, my virtue." Her face, which had been pale with fear, hardened. A cold, sharp anger began to burn in her eyes. He took the letter, he read it, and then he laughed. He said it was a fine piece of fiction. He accused me. He said I was deceitful, that I had the eyes of a liar and that I was no better than the women in the Laramie saloons. He said I had tricked him. Eli remained perfectly still, his back a rigid wall of muscle. "I told him he was wrong. I told him I was an honest woman." Cora's voice dropped to a whisper, and she looked at her hands. "He did not like being contradicted. He grabbed the letter, my pastor's letter, and he tore it into pieces. He threw them into the fire. He said, 'Your honor is whatever I say it is, and I say you have none.'" The cabin was so silent, Eli could hear the faint hiss of the sap in the burning pine. "He told me to get out," she said, her voice now flat, devoid of all emotion, as if she were reciting a grocery list. "He unlocked the bedroom door, and then the main door. He told me to get out of his house. I saw the snow. I told him, 'It is a blizzard. I will die.' And he smiled at me. He said, 'That is your concern, not mine.' He put his hand on my back, and he pushed me. He pushed me off the porch. I fell into a snowdrift. The door shut. I heard the bolt slide home, and I heard the servants laughing inside." She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, though the cabin was warm. "I ran. I did not know where I was going. I just ran. I fell. I kept getting up. I could not feel my feet or my face. I did not want to die on his doorstep. I would not give him that satisfaction. I thought I saw a light, far away. I walked toward it. I remember a door. A door slamming in the wind. I thought, just for a minute, just to get out of the wind. I thought I would die in that barn, but it was warm. Warmer than his heart. I thought, at least I will not die where he can find me. Eli Mercer stood up. He was not a fast-moving man, but he moved with purpose. He walked to the single window of the cabin and scraped the frost from the glass with his thumbnail. He stared out at the white, unforgiving landscape. His jaw was so tight the muscles in his cheek jumped. Logan Voss. It was not just a name. It was the source of every major problem in this valley for the last 2 years. It was Voss who had illegally claimed the upper fork of the creek, damming it and diverting the water that was supposed to be shared by all the homesteaders in the basin. It was Voss whose men drove cattle across smaller farms, trampling new crops with impunity. And it was Voss who had ridden onto Eli's own property just last month. In October, he had sat on his fine, silver-inlaid saddle, flanked by 2 armed riders, and looked at Eli's small, strong cabin, and the forge he had built next to it. "This is a good piece of bottomland. Blacksmith," Voss had said, his voice as smooth and cold as river ice. "Too good for a one-man operation. I will be making you an offer soon. I suggest you take it. I always get what I want." Eli had just stared at him, holding a 20-pound hammer, and said, "This land is not for sale." Voss had smiled, a thin, reptilian expression. "Everything is for sale. Mercer, it just depends on the price, or the pressure." Now, Eli understood. Voss did not just buy, he took, and what he could not use, what he deemed flawed, he threw away to die in the cold. He turned back to Cora. The story was told. The fear was back in her eyes. But it was a different fear now. It was the fear of consequences. "I cannot stay," she said, her voice shaking as she tried to gather the blankets around her, to stand. "He will find me here. He will do to you what he did to me. He will ruin you. He will take your land. I must leave." She made to stand, to gather her dignity, to walk back out into that white hell. No. It was one word, but it was absolute. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. It was iron. "You are not leaving this cabin, ma'am," Eli said. "Not until you are well, and not until you have a safe place to go." "You do not understand," she pleaded, tears starting to well in her eyes. "He is a powerful man. He will destroy you for helping me." "I understand him well enough," Eli cut in. His voice was not unkind, but it was firm. He walked over to the hearth and crouched down, a difficult thing for a man his size, putting him at her eye level. He was no longer looming. "In this valley," he said, his dark eyes steady and unblinking. "Men like Voss, they think they own the law. They think they own the weather. They think they own the water. They think they own people." He held her gaze. "Here, in this cabin, my law stands, and my law is simple. Anyone thrown out a door in a storm has a place by this fire." He did not look away. "You are not a problem, ma'am. You are a guest. You will stay." The tears that had been welling in Cora's eyes finally broke. They were the first tears she had shed since leaving Missouri. They were not tears of fear or of pain, but of some terrible, aching, unbelievable relief. She could not speak. She only nodded. A short, jerky motion. "Good," Eli said, standing up, his tone shifting back to the practical. "The broth is hot. I will get you some clothes." He went to a small wooden chest at the foot of his simple cot. He opened it and pulled out several items. They were folded neatly and smelled of lye soap and cedar. "These were my mother's," he said, his voice softening just slightly. "She passed 2 years back. They will be large on you." She was a stout woman, but they are warm, and the boots are soft. He laid them on the chair. A thick wool skirt the color of oatmeal, a pair of knitted stockings, and a flannel shirt, and a pair of fur-lined boots, the leather worn but supple. Cora looked at the clothes, then at him. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." "Eli," he said. Her eyes were still cautious. This world had taught her in the space of 24 hours that kindness always had a price. But for the first time since she had stepped off the train in Laramie, she saw something in a man's face that was not hunger or coldness or cruelty. It was just decency. And in that decency, a small, fragile seed of hope began to thaw. Later that afternoon, Eli was splitting wood by the side of the cabin, the rhythmic thunk crack of his axe the only sound in the frozen world. Cora was inside, finally asleep again, this time on his cot. Dressed in the warm, borrowed clothes, he paused, resting on the axe handle, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He looked out across the valley, his land, his home. His eyes narrowed. They were about a quarter-mile off, but the air was clear and cold, and the endless snow made everything stark. A rider. Then two more. They were sitting on their horses on the low ridge that marked the edge of Eli's property. They were not admiring the view. They were looking at his cabin, at the thin, steady plume of smoke rising from his chimney. They wore the thick, expensive-looking coats of Voss's ranch hands. They sat there for a long time, maybe 10 minutes, perfectly still, just watching. They were too far away to see inside, too far to be sure of anything, but they were a message. One of them spurred his horse, making it rear, and then the three of them wheeled their mounts around and rode back toward the sprawling, dark shape of the Voss ranch, which dominated the far end of the valley. Eli watched them go. He looked down at the snow near his fence line. They had not come close, not yet, but they had left their tracks, a dark, deliberate line cut into the pure, clean white, a warning. Eli gripped the smooth, worn handle of the axe. He looked back at his small cabin, at the single window where a woman he did not know was hiding from a man he despised. He had invited her to his hearth. He knew. As he hefted the axe and split another log with a sharp, angry crack, that he had just invited a war to his door. The blizzard did not pass. It settled. After the first night of its violent arrival, the wind did not abate, but it ceased to scream, lowering its voice to a steady, relentless roar that vibrated in the logs of the cabin. The world outside the frosted window vanished, reduced to a solid, moving wall of white. The high basin was gone. The mountains were gone. There was only the cabin, a small wooden island in a churning, frozen ocean. And inside, there was life. The first day was a day of profound, aching quiet, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind, and the sound of Eli splitting more wood just outside the door. Cora, dressed in his late mother's flannel and wool, moved with the stiffness of a body that had brushed against its own mortality. Her hands and feet were a universe of pain, a constant, throbbing, fiery itch as the blood, pushed back by the frost, reclaimed its territory. She spent most of that first day huddled by the fire, drinking the broth Eli handed to her, and watching. She watched him. He was a man of few words and constant motion. He did not seem to pace. He simply worked. He checked the seals on the window, finding a draft and caulking it with a strip of oiled cloth. He took down the damaged porch lantern, dismantled it on the table, and patiently, with those massive, scarred hands, repaired the brass cage. He went to the barn twice, disappearing into the white void for an hour at a time, returning caked in snow, his beard a solid mass of ice. He would nod to her a simple acknowledgement of her presence and go about his business. He had given her his cot. He had taken the bearskin rug from the hearth and laid it near the door with 2 thick horse blankets. He had given her the only bed without a word of discussion. Flint, the old hound, had become her shadow. The dog seemed to understand that she was a creature wounded and in need of guarding. He lay at her feet, his white muzzle resting on her boot, his cloudy eyes fixed on the door. He was a living, breathing barrier. On the second day, Cora could no longer sit still. The pain in her hands had subsided to a dull ache. She felt a deep, profound need to be useful. She was a guest, yes, but she was also a burden. She knew what men like Voss thought of burdens. While Eli was out checking the stock, she began to clean. She tidied the small shelf of tinned goods, swept the hearth, and then she found his mending basket. It was overflowing with torn gloves, a shirt with a ripped sleeve, and half a dozen wool socks worn through at the heel. She sat by the fire, threaded a needle, and began to work. When Eli returned, he stopped by the door, stomping the snow from his boots. He watched her for a long moment. Her head was bent, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her fingers, though still swollen and red, moved with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. "You do not need to do that," he said, his voice rough from the cold. Cora did not look up, but she did not stop her work. "It is better than being idle. Mr. Mercer." "Eli," he corrected her again, gently. She nodded, pulling a knot tight. "Eli." She held up the glove she had just finished. The seam was not just closed, it was nearly invisible. A tight, perfect braid of thread. "My mother was a seamstress," she said quietly, her voice finding a new, stronger tone in the warmth of the cabin. "She sewed for the church. She taught me that you could hide a world of sorrow in a stitch so small no one else could see it. She said it made the seam stronger." Eli hung his ice-crusted coat on a peg. He did not know what to say to that, so he said what was true. "It is fine work, finer than this cabin is used to." He sat across from her, beginning the slow work of thawing his beard, and found himself talking. He told her about the forge, how he had come west with his father, intending to build a life on the anvil. He told her how he used to shoe every horse in the basin, how he knew every man's character by the way his horse wore its irons. "A man who rides his horse too hard on the left," he said, rubbing his hands together. "His left shoe will wear thin on the outside edge. Always. You learn who is patient and who is cruel by looking at the iron." Cora listened. She learned more about him in that hour of shared work than she had known about Logan Voss in her entire, disastrous arrangement. The storm raged for a third day, and a fourth. The cabin became a self-contained world. The air grew thick with the smell of drying wool, hot coffee, and the scent of the sourdough. Cora had found his starter crock in the pantry, the dough inside cold and dead. She had brought it to the hearth, fed it with a little flour and water, and nursed it, just as he had nursed her, and just like her, it had slowly, miraculously, come back to life. On the fifth day, she was baking. The cabin was filled with the rich, tangy smell of rising bread. That same afternoon, they went to the barn together. The wind had dropped just enough, and Eli needed to check a drift that was threatening the north wall. He told her to stay, but she insisted. "I cannot hide from the wind forever." He wrapped one of his own scarves around her face, leaving only her eyes exposed. The cold was shocking, a physical blow, but the barn was secure. The animals were safe, warm in their stalls. It was on the way back that Cora stopped. She was looking at the small irrigation ditch that ran from the creek to Eli's fields, the one he had dug by hand. It was completely buried, choked with a solid, frozen mass of snow. "Your snow fence," she said, her voice muffled by the scarf, pointing to the line of planks Eli had erected. "It is piling the snow into the ditch." "I know it," Eli grunted, frustrated. "It is angled wrong. I have to dig it out by hand every spring. A week's work, at least." Cora stood there, her head tilted, studying the patterns the wind had carved in the drifts, the way the snow curled around the corner of the barn. "You have it facing the wind," she said. "That is the point of a fence," he replied. "I think," she said, speaking with a sudden, quiet authority, "that you are fighting the wind. You should use it. If you moved the fence, not there, but further back, and angled it about 30 degrees more to the northwest, I think the wind would come around this corner and scour that ditch clean for you. It would keep the snow off, not pile it on." Eli stopped. He looked at the fence. He looked at the barn. He looked at the angle of the drifts. He pictured what she was describing. The wind, hitting that new angle, would create a vortex, a back current. He looked at her, this small woman in his mother's oversized clothes. She was not just a seamstress. She was not just a victim. She was intelligent. "That," he said slowly, "is a very sound idea. A remarkable idea." She just nodded. as if it were obvious, and continued the trudge back to the cabin. Eli Mercer followed her, his respect for her deepening in a way that startled him. The moment that changed everything, however, came that evening. It was the sourdough. Cora, emboldened by her success, had fed it again. The cabin was warm, the fire roaring. The starter, now bursting with life, began to climb. It climbed out of the crock. It flowed onto the pantry shelf. It dripped in a thick, sticky, bubbling ribbon onto the floor. Cora found it and let out a small, horrified gasp. "Oh, no! Oh, gracious!" She was trying to scrape the living, sticky mass back into the crock when Eli came in from the porch, where he had been repairing the hinge on the door. He took one look at the mess, the flour dust in the air, the frantic look on Cora's face. "It seems to have," he started to say, "recovered." At that exact moment, a heavy dollop of the overflowing dough, which had been clinging to the shelf above him, let go. It landed squarely on his head, covering his dark hair and a large part of his beard in a thick, white, bubbling paste. He froze. Cora froze, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute horror. She was certain he would be furious. She had wasted his flour. She had made a fool of him. Eli Mercer stood perfectly still. He slowly reached up and touched the glob in his hair. He looked at the dough on his fingers. Then his broad shoulders began to shake. A low sound started in his chest, a rumble that sounded like rocks moving. It was a laugh. He threw his head back and let out a deep, genuine, booming laugh that filled the small cabin, a sound that seemed to push back against the wind itself, seeing this large, serious man standing there, covered in sourdough. Laughing was too much. The terror that had been lodged in Cora's throat for 5 days finally broke. A small, alien sound escaped her, a giggle, then another. She laughed. It was a high, rusty sound, as if the mechanism had forgotten how, but it was real. They stood in the middle of the mess, and for one precious minute, they laughed until tears ran down their faces. The ice, in all its forms, had finally broken. That night, the laughter faded, and the darkness returned. Cora woke up with a choked scream, her hands batting at the blankets. She was thrashing, her eyes wide open but seeing nothing in the room. "The torches," she whimpered, her voice raw with terror. "He is coming. The heavy steps. I hear him. Let me go." Eli was across the room in 2 strides, but he remembered her fear. He did not touch her. He stopped 5 feet from the cot, keeping his voice low and steady. "Cora, you are safe. You are in my cabin. It is Eli." She blinked, the nightmare fading, the reality of the small, warm room returning. She saw him, a large shadow against the firelight. She was shaking violently, shame and fear warring on her face. "I dreamed," she whispered, pulling the blankets to her chin. Eli did not go back to his bedroll. He understood. The fear was a poison, and it worked its way deepest in the dark. He went to the stove, stirred the embers, and put the kettle on. He brewed her a cup of strong tea with a spoonful of honey. He handed it to her, their fingers brushing. She took it, her hands still shaking. "You do not have to—" "I know," he said. He did not go back to his spot by the door. He took one of his blankets, sat down on the cold plank floor at the foot of her cot, and leaned his back against the wall. He was a bulwark of wool and quiet resolve, a guardian. "I am right here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He is not here. No one is coming. Go back to sleep." Cora watched him over the rim of the cup. He was not looking at her. He was staring at the door, as if daring the storm or Logan Voss himself to try and break it down. She drank the tea. She lay back down, and, for the first time since leaving Missouri, she slept without fear, protected not by a lock, but by a man sitting a watch on her floor. The storm broke 2 days later. The wind died as if a switch had been thrown. The silence of the snow was heavier than the storm itself. The world was born anew, blinding white and painfully bright. "We should check the livestock properly," Eli said, squinting into the new sun. "One of the mares is due." They walked to the barn, the snow crunching under their boots. The air was so cold it felt sharp in the lungs. They found the mare. Not just due, but delivered. In the deep, clean straw of the birthing stall stood a new foal, long-legged and wobbly, its coat a dark, rich red. It was a miracle. A new life, born in the absolute darkest and coldest part of the year. While Cora stood transfixed by the foal, Eli went to move the mother to a clean stall with fresh water. He came back with a bridle, a simple thing of braided rope. "I have never seen one like that," Cora said, reaching out to touch it. "It has no metal bit." "It is a hackamore," Eli explained, his hands gentle on the mare's head. "A bossel. It works on pressure, on the nose. It is a gentler way. You do not need to break a horse's spirit with iron to teach it. You just need to show it a better way. Ask it clearly." He showed her the complex, beautiful knot, how it balanced. He was, she realized, showing her how he operated. He did not break. He did not force. He asked. They stood for a while, watching the foal take its first uncertain steps, the mare nudging it patiently. "It needs a name," Eli said, his voice quiet. Cora looked around the warm barn. The air was sweet with hay and horses, but also the sharp, clean, resinous smell of the wood Eli had used to build the stalls. "Juniper," she said. "The smell. It is juniper wood. It is a strong tree. It survives the cold and the wind. It just endures." Eli looked at her, and then at the foal. "Juniper," he repeated. He nodded, a slow smile touching the corners of his mouth. "It is a fine name. Strong." That evening, Cora stood on the porch Eli had repaired. The sun was setting, painting the endless snow in shades of deep purple and rose. The sky was clear, a vast, cold, brilliant blue, and the first stars were appearing, sharp as diamonds. She pulled the borrowed shawl tighter around her shoulders. She looked up at that impossible, open sky. "Perhaps," she whispered, her breath a small white cloud in the frigid air. "Perhaps God has not forgotten me." The thaw came, and with it, the world returned. For nearly 2 weeks. The high basin had been a silent, snow-locked world, and the cabin a fortress. But as the new year of 1889 turned, the sun found its strength. The heavy, monolithic drifts began to soften, to shrink, to weep water. The frozen creeks began to crack and groan, and as the snow receded, the tracks returned. So, too, did the rumors. It started at the Voss ranch. His men, no longer confined by the weather, rode the fences. They had seen the smoke from Eli Mercer's chimney every day. They had seen the figures moving, one large, one small. They had seen the blacksmith who lived like a hermit, who was now clearly not alone. The rumor traveled from the Voss bunkhouse to the saloon in Laramie, and from there to the general store. It was a juicy piece of gossip. Sharp and mean, Logan Voss, the richest man in the territory, had his mail-order bride run off, and not just run off, but run straight to the cabin of the blacksmith up the valley, the quiet one, the basin, which had been starved for news, feasted on it. Sides were taken before the facts were even known. Some said the woman was a harlot, plain and simple, who had taken one look at Voss's hard life and fled to the first man she saw. Others, the ones who had dealt with Voss and his heavy-handed ways, whispered something darker. They had seen the look in Voss's eye. They had seen how he treated his cattle. They said that blacksmith had better be ready for a fight. The fight did not come in the form of gunfire. It came in the form of the law. It was a Tuesday morning, bright and cold. The sound of dripping water, the only music in the valley. Eli was in his forge, the first time in weeks. The rhythmic clang, clang, clang of his hammer on the anvil, a reassuring heartbeat. Cora was on the porch, mending a heavy horse blanket, her face turned toward the weak, watery sun. Flint was asleep at her feet. The sound of horses made her look up. It was not one rider. It was two. They were not cowboys. They wore official-looking coats. One was a large, heavy-set man whose face was a map of compromises. The star pinned to his coat, tarnished and dull, marked him as Sheriff Deke Moreland. The other was a man as thin and dry as a corn husk, carrying a leather satchel. Cora's hand stopped moving. The needle froze in the wool. Flint lifted his head and let out a low, uneasy growl. Eli heard the growl before he heard the horses. He came out of the forge, wiping his hands on a rag, his heavy leather apron still tied at his waist. He was a solid wall of muscle and soot. He looked at the men, then at Cora, and his face settled into hard, impassive lines. The two men dismounted, their boots sinking slightly in the mud and melting snow. "Mr. Mercer," the sheriff said, his voice trying for authority but landing on weary. "Sheriff?" Eli acknowledged. He did not invite them closer. The thin man stepped forward, brushing snow from his satchel. "I am Mr. Finch, the county recorder. We are here on an official matter regarding a complaint filed by Mr. Logan Voss." Finch opened his satchel and took out a piece of paper. It was heavy, embossed with a county seal. He cleared his throat. "We are here for Mrs. Logan Voss." Cora, who had stood up, flinched as if struck. The name was a brand. "There is no one here by that name," Eli said, his voice flat. "Mr. Finch sighed, an exasperated sound. "Mr. Mercer, let us not be difficult. We have a legal, binding marriage certificate, filed and recorded on the 2nd of January this year, signed by Justice Miller. It attests that Mr. Logan Voss and one Miss Cora Ellison were legally wed." He held the paper out. "This document gives Mr. Voss legal authority. She is his wife. The lady's name is Cora Ellison." Eli said, "She is a guest in my home." "She is a runaway wife," Finch snapped, his patience gone. "And you, sir, are harboring her, which is a crime. Sheriff, do your duty." Sheriff Moreland looked at Eli, then at Cora, who was standing on the porch. Her hands gripped so tightly together her knuckles were white. She was trembling, the old, bone-deep terror returning, but she did not retreat. "Ma'am," Moreland said, his voice softening with a trace of pity. "Mrs. Voss, your husband wants you home. We have to take you home." Cora's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the cold air. "He does not have a home. He has a house, and he threw me out of it." Finch scoffed. "Ma'am, a domestic squabble is a matter for you and your husband. It does not invalidate a legal contract. Now, please, get your things." "He threw me out into the blizzard," Cora said, her voice gaining a strange, cold clarity. She took a step forward, to the edge of the porch. "He told me to die. He pushed me from that porch and bolted the door. He tried to murder me." Moreland and Finch looked at each other. This was more complicated than they had been told. "Those are very serious accusations, ma'am," Moreland said, shifting his weight. "And they are true," Eli said. He took a step forward, planting himself between the lawmen and the porch. "I am the one who found her." "So the rumor says." Finch sneered. "A convenient story. I do not trade in stories." Eli said, "I trade in facts." He turned, walked into the cabin, and came back out a moment later holding a heavy, leather-bound book. It was his forge ledger. "I am a blacksmith. I keep a log of my work. And of events. It is a habit of a man who deals in measures." He opened the book to a page, his thick, stained finger running along a line of neat, precise script. "December the 30th, 1888, he read, his voice resonating like a church bell. 9 o'clock post-meridium, approximately. Found one female, unknown, in South Barn. Temperature estimated at 0, with winds exceeding 50 miles per hour. Condition severe hypothermia, frostbite evident on hands and feet. Frozen ice visible in hair and on clothing. Pulse was present, but weak." He looked up, his eyes as hard as the iron he worked. "I logged it, Mr. Finch, just as I would log a shipment of coal. These are the facts of the night." Finch looked staggered. A blacksmith's meticulous log was a powerful piece of evidence in a land where most men could barely sign their own name. It is his word." Finch sputtered, looking to the sheriff. "His word against a legal document?" "No, a new voice said. It was sharp, clear, and carried absolute authority. It is not. Mabel Quinn, the basin's midwife, emerged from the cabin door, holding Cora's ruined wedding dress in her hands. She was a woman in her 60s, small and iron gray, and there was not a man in the valley, including the sheriff, who dared cross her. Eli had ridden out to fetch her 3 days ago, under the guise of buying supplies, to have her check Cora's recovery. He had known this day was coming. "Sheriff Moreland, Mr. Finch," she said, her eyes snapping. "I am an officer of the court in this territory, same as you. I have delivered half the children in this basin and buried the other half. My word is my bond." She held up the dress. The delicate satin was ripped, stained with mud and hay, and stiff as canvas. "I examined Miss Ellison at Mr. Mercer's request," Mabel said, her voice ringing with cold fury. "I treated her for frostbite so severe it is a miracle of God she still has all her fingers. I also documented, in my own log, bruising across her upper back and shoulders, bruises consistent with being shoved violently from a height, marks on her wrists that were not from the cold. I will stand in any courtroom, so help me God, and I will testify that this woman was not a runaway. She was an intended victim." Sheriff Moreland took his hat off and wiped his sweating brow with his sleeve, though the air was freezing. The solid ground of the law had just turned into a swamp. On one hand, he had Voss and a marriage certificate. On the other, he had Eli Mercer's log and Mabel Quinn's sworn medical testimony. "Mabel, Eli," Moreland began. This is a terrible mess. It is a mess you must now clean up, Sheriff," Mabel said, folding the dress with a snap. "What is this?" a new voice drawled, cold and smooth as polished stone. "A town meeting." 4 riders crested the low ridge, their horses kicking up slush. They were not lawmen. They were Voss's men. And at their head, on a magnificent black stallion with a silver inlaid saddle, was Logan Voss. He was dressed in a heavy coat of dark wolf fur, his hat pristine. He looked rested, powerful, and deeply amused. He rode his horse right onto Eli's yard, stopping just feet from the sheriff. He did not dismount. He looked down on them all, a king surveying his subjects. "Sheriff," Voss said, a cold smile playing on his lips. "Mr. Finch, I see you have located my property." He did not look at Cora. He looked at Eli. "Mercer, your little game is over. I'm here to take my wife home." He swung his leg over the saddle, dropping lightly to the ground. His men fanned out behind him, their hands resting casually on the holsters at their hips. "Now, Voss," Sheriff Moreland said, stepping forward, his hand held up. "It is not that simple. Mrs. Quinn and Mr. Mercer have made some claims." Voss laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. "Claims a bitter old woman and a blacksmith who is harboring her. I am shocked." He took a step toward the porch. "Cora, get your things. You have embarrassed me enough." Cora shrank back, all the color draining from her face. Eli stepped off the porch and stood directly in Voss's path. He was not armed. His heavy forge apron hung to his knees. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his forearms thick with muscle and dark with soot. He was an immovable object. "She is not going anywhere. Voss," Eli said. His voice was not loud, but it was final. Voss's smile vanished. His eyes went dead and cold. "Get out of my way, blacksmith. This is a family matter." "It stopped being a family matter when you tried to kill her," Eli said. The air crackled. Voss's men tensed. "Sheriff," Voss said, his voice dropping to a dangerous hiss. "Arrest this man. He's interfering with my legal rights." "Mr. Finch, show him the paper," Voss demanded. Finch, terrified, held up the marriage certificate like a shield. "Mr. Mercer, you are in violation of the law. The paper is legal." "That paper," Eli said, his eyes never leaving Voss, "is a piece of paper. It is not a death warrant." He turned his head just enough to address the sheriff. "Sheriff Moreland, you are an officer of the peace. Mabel Quinn, a sworn midwife, has just given you testimony of a violent crime. I have given you witness evidence. Are you going to enforce that piece of paper, or are you going to enforce the law?" Moreland was trapped. The entire basin's simmering resentment toward Voss was now balanced on his shoulders. He could not arrest Eli. Mabel Quinn's testimony gave Eli every right to protect a potential victim. He could not let Voss take her. It would be sanctioning a crime. But he could not arrest Voss. The man's power was too great, and the evidence was, for now, circumstantial. "I will drag her out myself." Voss snarled, and he shoved Eli in the shoulder. It was like shoving an oak tree. Eli did not budge. He did not raise his hands. He just stood, a silent, solid presence. "Enough," Moreland shouted, finally finding his spine. He put his hand on his own pistol. "Voss, you stand down, Mercer. You stand down." He was sweating heavily now. "This is not for a yard to decide, and it is not for me to decide. Not here, not now." "The law is clear," Finch protested. "The situation is not," Moreland roared. "We have a legal certificate, and we have a sworn accusation of attempted murder. This is a matter for the community, for the council." Moreland looked at Voss, then at Eli. "We will have a public hearing at the Valley Meeting House 1 week from today. The council will hear all of it. Yourselves, Mrs. Quinn, Mr. Finch, and you, ma'am." He pointed at Cora. "They will hear all of it, and they will decide what is to be done until the circuit judge can be summoned." "A hearing?" Voss was incredulous. "You are holding a hearing for my wife." "I am," Moreland said, his jaw set. "And until that day, Miss Ellison remains here, in the care of Mr. Mercer, as a witness. And Voss," he said, turning on the rancher, "you and your men will stay away from this property. That is my order, as sheriff. You violate it, and I will arrest you for intimidation. Paper or no paper." Voss stared at the sheriff, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He had been denied, publicly. He looked past Eli to Cora, who was watching from the porch, her face pale but her eyes defiant. He looked back at Eli, and the look he gave him was a promise of absolute ruin. Without another word, Logan Voss turned, swung himself up onto his magnificent horse, and wheeled it around. "1 week," he called out, his voice echoing in the yard. "Enjoy it, blacksmith." He and his men spurred their horses, sending mud and slush flying, and galloped away. Sheriff Moreland let out a long, shaky breath. He put his hat back on. He looked at Eli and at Cora. "1 week," he said, his voice heavy. "Be ready. He will not come with lawyers. He will come to destroy you." He and Finch mounted their horses and rode off, leaving Eli and Cora standing in the ruined, muddy yard, the scent of wood smoke and the faint, cold smell of fear hanging in the air. The 7 days that followed were not a time of waiting. They were a time of work. The high basin did not permit idleness, and fear was a poor substitute for a full wood pile. The confrontation in the yard had drawn a line in the snow, and now Eli and Cora existed in the small, quiet space on their side of it. Eli returned to his forge. The sharp, steady ring of his hammer on the anvil became the new rhythm of their days, a sound of defiance, a sound that said, "I am still here." He worked from sunrise until the light failed, his face grim, his movements powerful, channeling his cold anger into the hot iron. Cora, in turn, took possession of the cabin. It was no longer a temporary shelter. It was a fortress to be prepared. She found the old clothesline Eli's mother had used, the rope rotted through. Eli gave her a new length, and she spent an afternoon in the sharp, watery sunlight, stretching it between the porch and the nearest pine, her hands red with cold, her breath pluming. It was a simple, domestic act, but it felt like reclaiming territory. The windows, bare and exposed, had felt like eyes staring out, waiting for Voss. She found a bolt of heavy canvas in Eli's mother's chest and began to sew. She sat by the fire, her needle flying, creating thick, heavy curtains that could be drawn against the night, against the valley, against the fear. Eli came in one evening, smelling of coal smoke and sweat, and watched her mending one of his work shirts. He was a master of iron, but a needle and thread were foreign tools to him. His own men's were clumsy, functional knots. Hers were invisible. "What do you call that?" he asked, his voice low, gesturing to the intricate pattern of thread she was weaving into a tear near the cuff. "My mother called it the honeycomb stitch," Cora said, not looking up. The firelight caught the concentration in her face. "She said it was for mending a tear you thought would never hold. It pulls the cloth together from behind, distributing the strain, so the seam becomes stronger than the original fabric." Eli nodded slowly. He understood. He looked at her, so small and fierce, stitching his world back together, one honeycomb at a time. The next day, he did not just work on horseshoes. He spent 2 hours on something else. The stew pot in the kitchen hung from a crude iron nail, and it annoyed him. It was unbalanced. He took a piece of fine-quality round stock, heated it until it glowed a bright, angry orange, and brought it to the anvil. He did not rush. He hammered with a different rhythm, not the percussive blows of utility, but the shaping, loving taps of a craftsman. He drew it out, tapered the ends, and bent it into a long, graceful S-curve, a swan's neck, before it cooled. While the metal was still a dull, receptive red, he took his smallest, sharpest punch, the one he used for lettering, and looked around the empty forge. He turned the hook over, on the back, the part that would rest against the wooden beam. He struck a single, clean, perfect letter, a C. He installed it that evening, climbing on a stool to drive it deep into the main ceiling beam above the stove. "This will hold the heavy pot better," he said, his voice gruff, as if he were embarrassed. Cora came over, wiping her hands on an apron. She looked up at it. It was simple, elegant, and perfectly balanced. "It is beautiful," she said, her voice quiet. "It is too fine for a stew pot." "Iron must be useful," Eli said, turning away to stoke the fire, his face hidden. Later that night, when she was cleaning the pot, she reached up to wipe the new hook. Her fingers, still tender from the frost, traced the smooth, black curve. They found the back, and she felt it. The small, sharp-edged, deliberate letter. She stopped, her hand frozen. She touched it again, tracing its shape. A C, for Cora. She looked at Eli. He was at the table, his head bent over his ledger, the lamplight shining on his dark hair. He was not looking at her. He had not mentioned it. It was a secret, a mark, hidden from the world, that said you belong here. A slow, profound warmth, entirely separate from the fire, rose from her chest and spread up her neck. A blush so deep it made her ears burn. She smiled, a small, secret smile, and did not say a word. The snows had melted back, leaving the fields a patchwork of brown earth and thin, icy crust. The foal, Juniper, was testing her new legs, and Eli declared it was time to gentle her to a lead, and time for Cora to learn to ride. "I cannot always be here to drive you if you need to leave," he said, his reasoning practical, but the excuse was thin. They both knew she was not leaving. He led out his steadiest mare, a calm bay named Patience. "You must learn to balance," he said. "A horse knows if you are afraid, you must trust her." He cupped his massive hands. Cora, hesitant, placed her booted foot in his grasp, and he lifted her as easily as if she were a child, settling her onto the saddle. She felt impossibly high off the ground, her hands gripping the saddle horn. "No," he said, his voice gentle. "Not like that. You fight her. Just sit, feel her breathe. Your legs are your anchor. Your hands are for asking." He took the mare's lead rope. He did not mount his own horse. He began to walk, leading the mare in a slow, patient circle around the yard. Cora, perched precariously, held her breath. "Breathe," he commanded gently. "Let your body move with hers. You are not cargo. You are a partner." They walked for an hour, him pacing the muddy ground, her swaying in the saddle. until the panicked rigidity in her spine began to ease. He talked the entire time. Not about Voss, not about the hearing, but about the land. He pointed out the track of a snowshoe hare. He showed her the high ridge where the eagles nested in spring. He was grounding her, not just on the horse, but in this place, in his world. He led her down toward the creek, to the stand of giant skeletal cottonwoods that marked the edge of his property. The sound of the melting creek was a low, steady rush. He stopped the mare, and they stood in the quiet, the air smelling of damp earth and the sharp resin of pine. The wind, which was always present in the basin, gusted. Catching the woolen cloak she wore, his mother's cloak, it billowed around her, and a long, dark strand of hair, which had escaped her bun, whipped across her face, sticking to her cheek. She reached up to brush it away, her glove clumsy. "Wait," Eli said. He stepped closer. He raised his hand. It was his right hand, the one he used for the hammer, the palm and fingers a map of white scars and dark, ingrained soot. It was a huge, rough, intimidating hand. He lifted it to her face, intending only to brush the errant hair from her cheek. But then he stopped. His fingers hovered, a bare inch from her skin. The air around them became perfectly still, charged with a sudden, profound newness. He was not her rescuer. She was not his patient. In that one fractional moment, they were only a man and a woman, standing under a cold, open sky. He looked into her eyes. His gaze was not a demand, it was a question. "May I?" Cora's breath caught in her throat. She looked at that scarred, powerful hand, suspended in the air, offering a gentleness she had never known. She saw the patience in his eyes. He was not taking, he was asking. It was a world of difference. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Eli did not brush the hair away. His intention changed. His hand moved, very slowly, and his calloused, warm fingers came to rest on her shoulder. A light, steadying weight. He leaned in. He was clumsy. He was a man who had not known tenderness in a very long time, if ever. He pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion or of hunger. It was a kiss of simple, profound confirmation. It was warm and hesitant, and it tasted of the cold winter air, of coffee, and of the faint, clean smell of pine smoke that clung to him. It was a kiss that felt like two people, long frozen, relearning how to live. Her lips were soft under his, and for a moment, the entire, cold, terrifying world reduced itself to that one small, warm point of contact. He pulled back slowly. His hand was still on her shoulder, his thumb gently rubbing the thick wool of her cloak. They looked at each other, both of them slightly stunned, a shared, awkward smile touching both their faces. The air felt thick. Cora was the first to speak. She had to. She looked down at her hands, which were now resting on the saddle horn. "Mr. Mercer, Eli," she began, her voice a whisper. "I am not ready for promises or for what that ring meant." She looked up, her eyes clear and honest. "After him, I do not know if I can ever be." She took a shaky breath. "But I want to stay. Today, I want to be here." Eli's smile softened. He had not been disappointed. He had expected nothing. He nodded, his gaze steady and warm. "Today," he said, his voice a low rumble, "is enough. It is more than enough." They went back to the cabin as the light began to fail. The silence between them was different now. It was not empty, it was full. They cooked a stew, the two of them moving around the small kitchen in an easy, unspoken rhythm. He chopped the last of the root vegetables. She stirred the pot, which now hung securely from its new, graceful hook. Flint lay curled by the hearth, thumping his tail, a guardian of their domestic peace, sealing the evening in place. After they had eaten, as they sat by the fire, Eli stood up. He walked to the small pine chest where he had kept his mother's things, and where he had stored Cora's few, damaged belongings from her valise. He returned to the table and placed something on the rough-hewn wood between them. It was the dark blue velvet ribbon. He had washed it, carefully. It was clean, but the edges were still frayed where it had been torn, the fibers broken. It was the last ghost of that night, the symbol of her arrival, the mark of her trauma. Cora looked at it, lying on the table. It was a question. What do we do with this? She did not cry. She did not push it away. She simply looked at it for a long moment, seeing in it the blizzard, the freezing barn, and the man who had torn it. Then she stood. She went to her mending basket and took out her needle and a spool of dark blue thread. She sat back down. She picked up the ribbon. She threaded the needle, and, in the quiet, steady firelight, she began to sew. She did not try to hide the tear. She began to meticulously, patiently, stitch the frayed edges back together. She was not just mending a piece of velvet. She was mending her past. Her hand, once frozen and purple, was now steady and sure. Stitch by stitch, she was turning a wound into a scar into a straight, strong line. Eli watched her, saying nothing. He just watched her work, healing herself, right in front of his eyes. The quiet of the new week was a brittle thing, a thin sheet of ice over a dark, running current. The shared kiss under the cottonwoods had created a new, fragile peace. But the looming date of the hearing was a shadow that touched everything. Eli rose before dawn, his ritual unchanged. He checked the animals, his eyes scanning the ridges, his body tensed. It was on the third day before the hearing that he found the first violation. He was walking his fence line, the one that bordered the creek. When he stopped, the heavy wooden post that marked his northwest corner was not just down, it was gone. He found it 50 yards downhill, snapped at the base. He walked further and found the second marker. A heavy cairn of river stones he had built with his own father had been disassembled and moved 20 feet, tightening the line, shaving his property. He followed the new, false line to the creek. His heart turned cold. The irrigation ditch he and Cora had discussed, the one she had so cleverly analyzed, was now useless. It was not just blocked by snow. It was dammed. Sometime in the last 2 days, men had come down and felled 3 mature pines directly across it, then piled boulders to divert the main flow of the spring melt away from his land, pushing it west, toward the vast, thirsty acreage of the Voss Ranch. He returned to the cabin. His face was not red with anger. It was pale. His jaw set so hard a muscle jumped. Cora, seeing him, put down the coffee pot. He said nothing. He went to his father's old chest, retrieved the rolled canvas survey map of his claim, and spread it on the table. He stared at it, the black ink stark on the yellowed paper. The new line, the one made by the moved stones, cut off his water access entirely. It was not just an act of vandalism. It was an execution. He is choking us, Eli said, his voice quiet. He does not need to win the hearing. He is just taking the water. Cora came and stood beside him, her hand resting on the back of his chair. We will log it, she said, her voice steady, hard. We will add it to the evidence. The attack, they soon learned, was not finished. It came 2 nights later. It was just past 1 in the morning. Eli was asleep on his bedroll by the door, a position he had taken every night since the hearing was set. Cora was on the cot, lost in a deep, exhausted sleep. The cabin was silent. The fire banked to glowing red coals. It was Flint who saved them. The old hound, sleeping near the hearth, suddenly shot to his feet, a high, panicked, choking bark tearing from his throat. Eli was awake instantly, his hand moving not for a rifle, but for his boots. He did not hear anything, but he smelled it. It was not the smell of the pine hearth. It was the sharp, greasy smell of kerosene and the suffocating, acrid scent of burning hay. Fire! He roared, lunging for the door and throwing it open. The night was lit orange. It was not the cabin. It was the grain shed, the small, vital building that held the last of his winter feed and, more importantly, every sack of seed grain for the spring planting. It was not just a fire. It was a sentence of starvation. Cora was right behind him, pulling his mother's heavy cloak over her nightgown. She saw the flames licking the sky, the shed's roof already collapsing in a shower of sparks. "The bell!" she screamed. Eli did not hesitate. He ran to the heavy cast-iron bell by the porch, the one used to signal dinner or disaster, and began pulling the rope, sending a frantic, desperate clang, clang, clang ringing out into the cold. Dead night. It was a hopeless gesture, his nearest neighbor 2 miles away. But it was the cry of a man under attack. "The buckets! The trough!" Eli yelled, grabbing 2 pails. There was no time for a plan, only for the desperate, terrible rhythm of a bucket brigade. Eli, with his long, powerful strides, ran to the horse trough, plunged the buckets into the icy water, and ran to the fire, throwing the meager splash against a wall of flame. Cora, her face set, her bare feet scrambling in the half-frozen mud, grabbed the empty pails and ran them back, her lungs burning, her hands screaming as the cold metal handles stuck to her skin. They were losing. The dry wood, aided by the kerosene, was consumed in minutes. The roof fell in, sending a column of fire straight to the heavens. "We cannot save it," Eli yelled, his voice raw. "The seed, we have to save the seed." He abandoned the buckets. He grabbed a heavy fence post, and using it as a ram, he smashed the shed's side door, which was still holding against the inferno. A wave of heat and black smoke punched him in the face, singing his beard and eyebrows. "Eli, no!" Cora screamed. He ignored her, disappearing into the smoke. He found the sacks, stacked against the far wall, just beginning to smolder. He grabbed one, the burlap already hot to the touch, and threw it out into the yard. He grabbed another. He kicked a third sack toward the door, his boot smoking. He stumbled out, choking, dropped the second sack, and fell to his knees, his lungs void of air. Cora was there, dragging the heavy sacks away from the spreading fire, her small body straining. Eli got to his feet, took 2 ragged, agonizing breaths, and plunged back inside. He did this 4 times, a maddened, soot-blackened giant, rescuing their future from the flames, until the entire structure collapsed on itself. They stood, panting, their chests heaving, their faces black. They were splashed with muddy water and scorched by ash. Their hands were red and blistered. At their feet lay a pile of scorched, smoking, but largely intact sacks of seed. They had saved, perhaps, 60%. As the dawn came, a miserable, gray light. Eli walked the perimeter. He did not have to look far, in the soft mud near the creek, kept damp by the diverted water, were the tracks. 3 horses. They had come from the ridge, set the fire, and ridden back toward the ridge, back toward the Voss ranch. Sheriff Deke Moreland arrived 2 hours later, his horse ambling, his face weary. He had seen the smoke from town. "Eli," he said, stepping down, his eyes taking in the smoking ruin, the blistered hands of the blacksmith, the soot-streaked, defiant face of the woman. This is a terrible thing. It is attempted murder. Deke, again," Eli said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. He pointed to the tracks. "They lead up to his land." Moreland walked over and looked down at the hoofprints. He sighed, a long, tired sound. "Eli, these tracks are in mud. They are half filled with water. They could be from trappers. They could be from anyone." Do not," Eli said, taking a step toward the sheriff. "Say they could be mine." "I am not," Moreland said, raising a hand. "I am saying what a judge will say, that it is circumstantial. You have no proof. All you have is a feud, and now a fire. With the hearing just 2 days away, this looks bad for everyone. My advice, be careful. Do not make this bigger. Just state your facts at the hearing. Let the council decide." "So you are not going to arrest him?" Cora demanded, her voice shaking with a cold fury. "Arrest who, ma'am?" Moreland said, his face full of genuine pity. "The richest man in the territory, on the basis of a muddy hoofprint. All I can do is note the incident." He pulled out his pad, scribbled a few lines, and put it away. "I am sorry. Eli, I truly am. I will see you at the hearing." He mounted his horse and rode away, a man defeated by his own authority. Eli and Cora were left alone, standing in the cold morning light, the acrid smell of their ruined hopes filling the air. Eli looked at his hands, raw and burned, and he slowly clenched them into fists. He turned his eyes toward the Voss ranch. "Eli," Cora said, her voice sharp. She had seen that look before. It was the look of a man about to trade his life for a moment of justice. "I am ending this," he said. "No," she said, stepping in front of him, blocking his path. "You are not. That is what he wants. He set that fire to make you the animal. He wants you to ride over there with your hammer. He wants you to prove you are an unhinged blacksmith so he can put you in jail and take me. And this land, we are not fighting him. We are fighting the hearing, and we are not going to lose." Eli stared at her, his rage battling with her logic. "He burned our seed. Cora, the law just rode away. Then we will be the law," she said, her eyes flashing. "My father taught me that you do not win an argument with volume. You win it with facts. A cross-reference. We need to build a case so strong the sheriff cannot ignore it." She pointed to the ground. "You said you know horseshoes. What is specific about those tracks?" Eli's focus snapped. He knelt, his anger cooling, sharpening into the focused gaze of the craftsman. He studied the clearest print. He grunted. "The nails. It is a square-head nail. A custom-made head, not a standard nail. Who makes them?" "Orrin Pike, in town. He and I are the only ones." "Good," Cora said. "That is one piece. Now the water. He blocked it. This is not just about us. Eli, he is stealing from everyone downstream." "Who else lives on this creek?" "The Finleys," Eli said, his mind moving with hers. "The Strouds, and Mabel Quinn's pasture." "Then you will ride to them." Cora said, "Today, you will not talk about me. You will talk about the water. You will get them to sign a paper saying that creek has been community property for 10 years. "And you?" he asked. "I am going to town," she said. "I am going to visit Mr. Pike, and I am going to visit the printer." Eli saddled the mare. He rode west, toward his neighbors. He found them angry, their own ditches running low. When he showed them the dam, their fear of Voss was overwhelmed by their fury. Mabel Quinn signed the affidavit first, her signature a bold, angry slash. The others followed. Cora, meanwhile, rode to Laramie. She went straight to Orrin Pike's forge. The small farrier was terrified when he saw her. "Ma'am, I cannot get involved." "Mr. Pike," Cora said, her voice calm. "Someone burned our grain shed last night. The tracks were made by horses shod with square-head nails. Who buys them?" Orrin looked around, his hands twisting in his apron. "Please, ma'am, he will ruin my business. He will ruin this entire valley if he is not stopped." Cora said, "Who?" Voss Orrin whispered, the name like a curse. "Only him. He orders them special. Says they hold better in the high country. He bought 2 kegs last month." "Thank you, Mr. Pike," Cora said. "I will not ask you to testify. Eli will." She left the trembling farrier and went to the Laramie newspaper office, run by a sharp-eyed, ink-stained woman named Edna Vale. While there, Cora heard the whispers, the rumors Voss had been spreading all week, that she was a prostitute from Missouri who had stolen Voss's money. Edna looked at her, curious. "You are the talk, child." Cora ignored it. "I need you to print something for me. 50 copies. By this afternoon." She handed Edna a piece of paper. Edna read the words Cora had written, and her eyebrows shot up. She read it aloud, slowly. "An open hearing, Tuesday, 10 o'clock. High Basin Meeting House. Subject the water. Water belongs to the living, not the wallet." Edna looked at Cora, a slow, appreciative smile spreading. "This," Edna said, "is throwing a rock at the hornet's nest. The hornets are already burning the barn." Cora said, "Will you print it?" "I will," Edna said. "And I will not charge you. I like the headline." Cora took her flyers. She posted one in the general store, one at the post office, and gave a stack to Mabel Quinn. Then she rode home. As she passed the general store, she heard one of Voss's men, loud and drunk, telling the rumor about her past. Cora stopped the mare. She dismounted and walked up to him. The man faltered, surprised. Cora was calm. She reached into her pocket and pulled out 2 items. She held them up. One was the creased, formal letter from her pastor in Missouri, vouching for her character. The other was the mended, dark blue velvet ribbon. "You are telling stories about my past," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "This is my past." She held up the letter. "And this," she held up the ribbon, "is what your boss did to it." She did not wait for a reply. She mounted her horse and rode away, leaving the man in a stunned, sudden silence. That night, the night before the hearing, Eli and Cora sat at the table. The cabin was clean. They were clean. Their burned hands were wrapped in clean bandages. Between them, they laid out their case, piece by piece. The signed affidavit from 4 families about the water. Eli's forged ledger with the entry from December 30th. A perfect plaster cast Eli had made of the hoof print from the burned shed, and beside it, a single, identical, incriminating square-head nail from Orrin Pike's forge. "You were right," Eli said, his voice raw with a new, cold hope. He touched the plaster cast. "It is like shoeing a difficult horse. You cannot force it. Every piece has to fit, or the shoe will not hold." Cora placed her bandaged hand over his. "It fits, Eli. Every joint aligns." The High Basin Meeting House was not a courthouse. It was a one-room church, a town hall, and a schoolhouse, built of cottonwood and smelling of pine resin, oiled floors, and the sharp, metallic scent of the pot-belly stove. On this Tuesday morning, at 10 o'clock, it was filled beyond its capacity. The people of the valley were packed onto the hard wooden benches, shoulder to shoulder. Men who smelled of horse and hay, women in their best calico, their faces worn by wind and worry. They were not here for entertainment. They were here for a judgment. This was their valley, and the storm that had broken over Eli Mercer's cabin now threatened to engulf them all. At the front, at a simple trestle table, sat the 3 men of the Valley Council, Mr. Abernathy, a cattleman with a steady gaze, Mr. Finley, whose farm was downstream from Eli's, and old Jedediah Stroud. Sheriff Deke Moreland stood near them, his hat in his hands, looking profoundly uncomfortable. On the right side, near the front, sat Logan Voss. He was not dressed for a fight. He was dressed for a victory. He wore a fine wool suit, and beside him sat a man Eli did not know, a lawyer from Cheyenne, thin and pale, with a black leather satchel. On the left side, sitting alone on the first bench, were Eli and Cora. Eli wore his good shirt, the one Cora had mended, but he still looked like what he was, a blacksmith. His hands scrubbed, but the iron stains permanent in his skin. Cora was dressed in Eli's mother's simple brown wool dress. She was pale, her bandaged hands clasped in her lap, but her back was straight. Mabel Quinn sat directly behind them, a silent, iron-gray guardian. Edna Vale, the printer, was in the 3rd row, her notebook open. Orrin Pike, the farrier, was hiding near the back, looking as if he wished the ground would swallow him. "Mr." Abernathy struck the table with a wooden gavel. The murmur of the crowd died. "This hearing is called to order," Abernathy said, his voice filling the room. "This is not a formal court of law. We are here as a community council to hear 2 matters. First, a complaint by Mr. Logan Voss regarding his wife, Mrs. Cora Voss. Second, a complaint by Mr. Eli Mercer and others regarding water rights on the High Creek. Mr. Voss, as you brought the initial complaint, your man may speak first." The lawyer, Barrows, stood. He was all smooth edges and expensive wool. He smiled at the council, a gesture of superiority. "Gentlemen," Barrows said, his voice slick, "this is, in reality, a very simple matter. My client, Mr. Voss, a pillar of this community, has been grievously wronged." He reached into his satchel and produced the marriage certificate, holding it aloft. "We have here a legal, binding marriage contract, signed by a justice, recorded by the county. It is an irrefutable fact. Mr. Voss's new bride, in a fit of, shall we say, female confusion after her long journey, panicked and ran. She was found by Mr. Mercer. We are grateful, he gave Eli a cold nod, for his timely rescue, but his duty ended there, by harboring her now, against her husband's wishes. He is the one breaking the law. He gestured to Cora. This is not a matter for a council. It is a domestic matter. Mrs. Voss is confused. Her husband, in his generosity, wishes only to bring her home. We are asking the council to order the sheriff to return my client's legal wife to his protection, immediately. He sat down. It was clean. It was simple. It was, in the eyes of the law, correct. Abernathy looked at Eli. Mr. Mercer, your response. Eli stood. He did not look at the lawyer. He looked at the three men at the table. He did not bring a satchel. He carried his ledger, the plaster cast, and a rolled map. Mr. Abernathy, I am not a lawyer. I am a blacksmith. I will not speak of fits of confusion. I will speak of facts. He stepped forward and placed the heavy forge ledger on the table, opening it to the marked page. This is my logbook. I have kept one for 15 years. I entered this on the night of December 30th. I found Miss Ellison in my barn at approximately 9 o'clock. She was frozen. She was not confused. She was dying. He then unrolled his father's survey map. The linen cracked slightly. This is my claim, filed in 75. It shows the High Creek and the community ditch, as it has existed for over 10 years. He placed a second, smaller drawing beside it. This is the land as it stands today, with the markers moved and the creek dammed, an act of theft. He placed the signed affidavit on the table. And this is a paper signed by Mabel Quinn, Mr. Finley, and Mr. Stroud, attesting that the water he dammed is, and always has been, community property. The room was buzzing. Finley and Stroud, on the council, looked at the paper and then at Voss, their expressions hardening. This was no longer about a runaway bride. Finally, Abernathy said, his voice heavy. We must hear from the woman herself. Miss Ellison, will you please stand? Cora rose. Her legs felt weak, the floor unsteady. Every eye in the room was on her. She could feel Voss's gaze like a physical weight. Ma'am, Abernathy said, his voice not unkind. Mr. Barrows says you were confused, that you ran. Is this true? Cora looked at the council, then at the faces of the people. They were strangers. They were her only hope. My name is Cora Ellison, she began, her voice a reedy whisper. It trembled, and she stopped. She took a breath. She looked at Eli. He was watching her, his face a mask of quiet, absolute support. She found her strength. She spoke again, her voice clear and carrying in the silent room. My name is Cora Ellison. I came from Missouri to marry Mr. Voss. We were married by the justice. That part is true. She turned, her body rigid, and looked directly at Logan Voss. That night, he accused me of being a liar. He accused me of being impure. When I defended my honor, he took the letter from my pastor and he burned it. And then, she said, her voice dropping, he opened the door. The entire room leaned in. I told him there was a blizzard. I told him I would die. He smiled. He said that was not his concern. He told me to get out, and then he put his hand on my back, and he shoved me off the porch, into the snow. She paused, the memory raw and vivid. I heard the door shut. I heard the lock slide home, and I heard his servants laughing. I did not run. Mr. Barrows, I was thrown out. He did not try to protect me. He tried to murder me. The silence in the room was absolute. It was so quiet Eli could hear the faint drip of melting snow from the roof. The legal argument had just been annihilated by the human one. The lawyer, Barrows, saw it. He stood up, his smooth demeanor replaced by a sharp, reptilian smile. A moving performance, Mrs. Voss. Or is it Miss Ellison? You seem to change it to suit the company. He stepped toward her. You say he questioned your honor. Perhaps he had cause. Tell me, ma'am, what was your life in Missouri? Is it not true you were penniless, that you came west to attach yourself to a man of means? Is it not true that when you found the arrangement not to your liking, you immediately found another, a younger man? He gusted to Eli. Mr. Barrows, Abernathy said sharply. I am establishing character, Barrows snapped. Can you provide this counsel with any proof, any at all, of this virtue you claim? It was a public execution. Cora shrank, the shame of his words striking her with the force of a physical blow. She had no answer. Her letter was ash. That is enough. Mabel Quinn stood up. She was not shouting. Her voice was cold, flat, and absolute. You will sit down, Mr. Barrows, she said. The lawyer, stunned, looked at her. I will not be, I said. Mabel repeated, taking a step into the aisle. Sit down. I am a sworn officer of this territory, and you are badgering a witness and a victim. She turned to the council. Gentlemen, I have heard enough talk of virtue. I am a midwife. I deal in facts, not in rumors. I examined Miss Ellison on the 3rd of January. She was suffering from severe frostbite on all 10 fingers and both feet. She had contusions on her upper back and left shoulder, consistent with a violent, one-handed push from behind. The law may be interested in a woman's character, Mr. Barrows, but I am interested in the marks on her skin. The law does not measure a woman's dignity by the bruises on her back. She looked at the faces of the other women in the room, her gaze a challenge, or perhaps it does, and finds her dignity lacking because she was bruised at all. A low, angry murmur rose from the women. The lawyer, pale and shaken, sat down. Abernathy, seizing the moment, turned to Eli. Mr. Mercer, you mentioned a fire. Eli stepped forward. He placed the heavy plaster cast of the hoofprint on the table. 2 nights ago, my grain shed was burned. Kerosene, my seed for the year is mostly gone. I found this track in the mud by the creek. The horse was shod with custom-made square-head nails. He turned and looked toward the back of the room. I would like to call Mr. Orenpike. Orenpike froze. Every head turned to him. Voss turned, his eyes locking on the farrier. A cold, unmistakable threat. Mr. Pike, Abernathy called. Come forward. Oren looked as if he were walking to his own hanging. He stumbled down the aisle, his hands twisting his hat. Mr. Pike, Eli said, his voice gentle. You are a master farrier. You know every shoe in this basin. Do you recognize the nail pattern in this cast? Oren looked at the plaster cast. He looked at Voss. He looked at Eli. He was sweating, shaking. Mr. Pike, Abernathy prompted. Oren swallowed. He looked at Cora, at her bandaged hands. He looked at Eli's steady, patient gaze. He took a deep breath. Yes, he whispered. Yes, sir, I do. And who in this valley uses such a nail? Eli asked. Oren's eyes squeezed shut. It is a special order, a square head, very rare, holds tight in the high rock. Who, Mr. Pike? Oren's eyes snapped open, and he looked at the council, his voice suddenly loud in the silent room. Only one man, Mr. Logan Voss. I sold him 2 kegs last month. He is the only one who uses them. The only one. A collective gasp swept the room. It was not a rumor. It was a fact. It was a nail. The invisible link was now solid iron. The crowd erupted. Men were standing, shouting. Sheriff Moreland looked at Voss, his face pale, his hand moving toward his pistol. Silence! Abernathy roared, slamming the gavel. Logan Voss shot to his feet. His face was no longer calm. It was a dark, congested purple. His mask of civilized control was gone. This is a farce, he bellowed, shoving his lawyer aside. You are listening to a pack of liars. This is my valley. Mr. Voss, Abernathy said, his voice dangerously cold. The matter of the fire is now a criminal one, but the matter of the water is this council's. The water, Voss laughed, a sound of pure, arrogant rage. I bought that waterway. It is mine. I paid for it, just as I paid for her. The room went dead silent again. Voss had finally, fatally, overplayed his hand. Abernathy leaned forward. His eyes narrowed. You bought it, Mr. Voss. You bought the High Creek. Voss realized what he had said. His eyes darted to his lawyer, who looked horrified. It was an arrangement with the territory. Then you will have the deed. Abernathy pressed, his voice like a hammer. The bill of sale, Mr. Finch, he said to the county recorder, who was present. Is there any record of such a sale, Mr. Finch, who had been watching with keen interest, shuffled his papers. No, Mr. Abernathy, there is no such sale. The High Creek is designated community access on the original territory map. It belongs to the basin. Logan Voss was trapped. He stood there, his hands clenched, exposed as a liar and a thief in front of the entire community he had tried to dominate. Abernathy stood up, assuming the full height of his authority. This hearing is concluded. The council rules as follows. He looked at Cora. First, the matter of the marriage is for the circuit judge, but given the sworn testimony of Mrs. Quinn, this council places a temporary, binding order of protection. Mr. Voss, you are forbidden from approaching, contacting, or interfering with Miss Cora Ellison in any way. She will remain in the care of Mr. Mercer, Sheriff. You will enforce this. Moreland nodded, his hand on his gun, his eyes on Voss. Second, Abernathy continued, his voice hardening. You have publicly admitted to the theft of community water. You are ordered to remove your illegal dam from the High Creek. You have 24 hours to restore the flow. If you fail, the sheriff has this council's full authority to arrest you for theft of public resources. We are adjourned. The room exploded. Voss, his face a mask of unimaginable fury, stood frozen. His lawyer was grabbing his arm, babbling, but Voss did not hear him. Cora was still standing, her body rigid. The tension that had held her up for 3 weeks, the terror, the fight, it all evaporated at once. Her knees buckled. She did not fall. Eli was there. He did not grab her. He did not say a word. He simply offered his arm, his sleeve still faintly marked with soot. Cora looked at it. She looked at his steady, quiet face, her bandaged hand, the one that had mended his shirt, that had gripped the water bucket, that had signed her testimony, reached out. She took his arm. They walked, together, down the center aisle. The crowd parted for them, their faces a mixture of awe, pity, and a new, profound respect, as they reached the door and stepped out into the clean, cold sunlight. Logan Voss watched them go. His thin, cold smile was gone. His face was empty. He was a man who had lost everything, which meant he was a man with nothing left to lose. He was already planning. This was not over. This was just the law, and he had always been a man who operated outside of it. The weeks after the hearing settled into a new kind of quiet. It was not the silent, suffocating white of the blizzard, nor the tense, brittle quiet of waiting for a fight. It was a quiet of work, of shared purpose. Eli and the other homesteaders, emboldened by the council's ruling, had ridden up to the High Creek and, under the watchful, furious eyes of Voss's men, had dismantled the dam. The water, clear and cold, now flowed freely. Spring arrived, not as a gentle awakening, but as a muddy, chaotic thaw. The world dripped. The snow retreated in patches, revealing the brown, sleeping earth beneath. The air, once sharp as glass, became soft and heavy with the smell of damp soil and the promise of new life. And with that new life came the first spring rain. It came in the evening, not as a violent storm, but as a soft, persistent drumming. It was a sound that replaced the howl of the wind. The blizzard had screamed of death. This rain whispered of growth. It was a rhythmic, gentle tapping on the cabin's tin roof, a sound so peaceful it was almost a lullaby. Inside the cabin, the light was failing. A single lantern was lit on the table, casting a warm, yellow pool. The hearth fire was built low, a steady, crackling warmth against the cool, damp air that crept in through the slightly open window. That window, no longer frosted, carried the rich, clean smell of wet earth and pine. They were working. It had become their evening ritual. After the meal, they would sit, not in silence, but in a comfortable quiet, each with a task. Eli was mending a heavy saddle strap, the leather dark with oil, the main buckle broken. Cora, her hands now healed, the skin still shiny and pink but no longer raw, was sewing a new lining into his heavy winter cloak. Flint was asleep on the hearth, his paws twitching in some old, silent dream. Eli was holding the thick strap of leather steady, his thumb pressed hard, while Cora pushed the heavy saddler's needle through the resisting material. She was using her honeycomb stitch, the thread disappearing, the seam strong and invisible. "A bit more to the left," she murmured, her head bent. Eli shifted his grip. The leather was slick, his hand, calloused and scarred, slipped. The rough, sooty skin of his knuckles brushed the back of her hand, the one guiding the needle. It was an accident, a simple, grazing touch, but neither of them moved. The rain drummed on the roof. The fire crackled. The needle stopped, halfway through the leather. Cora did not pull her hand away. He did not pull his back. His hand hovered, then settled, the lightest of pressures, his skin against hers. The silence in the cabin, once so comfortable, became suddenly, profoundly thick. It was a silence that was listening. Eli looked at her. Her head was still bent, her face hidden, but he could see the sudden tension in her shoulder. He was a man of iron and wood. He did not know the language of soft words. He only knew the language of true things. He cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was a low, rough rumble, uncertain. "Cora," he said. He waited until she slowly, hesitantly, lifted her head, her eyes, wide and clear in the lamplight, met his. "Is this?" he asked, his voice raw. "All right." He was not asking about the mending. Cora looked at his hand, so large and dark against her own. She saw the scars from the forge, the ingrained soot that would never wash away. This was the hand that had pulled her from the ice, the hand that had held a cup of water to her frozen lips, the hand that had held her steady on the mare. She did not answer him with a word. She slowly, deliberately, turned her own hand over, the one that had been holding the leather. She uncurled her fingers and slipped them between his, lacing them together. Her small hand was lost in his massive one. It was her answer. She held his gaze, stood, and gently pulled. He stood with her, his chair scraping quietly on the plank floor. She did not release his hand. She led him, 2 small steps, away from the table, away from the work, and into the center of the room, into the warm, orange light of the hearth. She stopped in front of him, their joined hands resting between them. The firelight played on her, catching the curve of her jaw, the long, pale line of her throat. The light was warm, and it seemed to soak into the simple wool of her dress, making the fabric glow, outlining the soft, steady rise and fall of her breathing. He lifted his free hand, the one that had held the leather strap. He lifted it, just as he had done in the cottonwood grove, and he stopped, his fingers hovering. He was still asking. She closed her eyes, a small, trusting gesture. He laid his hand on her shoulder. It was a solid, steady weight, a claiming. He leaned down. The kiss was not like the first one. That had been a question, clumsy and cold. This was an answer. It was slow and deep and sure. It was not a kiss of demand. It was a kiss of relief. It was the taste of pine smoke and the faint, sweet taste of the tea they had shared. And it was, above all, warm. It was a warmth that started in her chest and spread out to the tips of her fingers, a warmth that pushed back the last, lingering ghosts of the blizzard. He pulled back, but only an inch. His forehead came to rest against hers. His hand, the one on her shoulder, slid down her back, learning the shape of her through the thick wool. It moved over her shoulder blade, down the delicate line of her spine, and came to rest on the curve of her hip. And then it stopped. His hand just lay there, a heavy, warm, solid presence. He did not pull her closer. He did not squeeze. He was not taking. He was, once again, waiting. His gaze was locked on her, asking the next question without a single word. She leaned into that hand. She gave a single, slow nod, a gesture of absolute, earned trust. That was all. He closed his eyes, his breath escaping him in a long, shaky sigh. He drew her in, all the way, his arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against the solid, immovable wall of his chest. Cora, finally, let go. The tension that had held her spine rigid for months, the brace against a blow, the constant preparedness to flee it all dissolved. Her own hands, which had been resting hesitantly on his arms, moved up, gripping his broad shoulders. Holding on, she pressed her face into the rough, clean wool of his shirt. They just stood there, holding each other, breathing in time with the rain. "I was so afraid," she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. "I know," he rumbled, his voice vibrating through her. "Me too." They stood there and let the silence and the rain answer all the things they could not say. They spoke of the storm. They spoke of the hearing. They spoke of the fear of what was next, and the warmth of their embrace. The steady, solid presence of the other was the only reply. Her breathing, which had been quick and shallow, slowed. It deepened. Matching his heart under her cheek was not the frantic hammering of a frightened man. It was a slow, powerful, steady thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of the forge hammer striking true. It was the sound of an axe splitting wood. It was a rhythm you could build a life on. It was a heart, she thought. That sounded like heavy, welcome hooves walking into a warm barn. Finally home. The trembling in her fingers, the last remnant of the frost, ceased. Her grip on his shoulders became sure. The spine that had been a rod of iron finally, fully, relaxed, and she leaned all her weight against him, trusting him to hold her. And he did. He did not let her go, but he shifted, guiding her to the small, worn settee by the hearth. They sat, and he kept his arm around her, pulling her close against his side. He reached for the heavy wool blanket folded at the end of the cot, the one he had used for so long on the floor. He shook it open and draped it over both of them, pulling it up high, tucking it around her shoulders. She sighed, a sound of profound contentment, and laid her head on his shoulder. He rested his cheek against the top of her hair. The fire in the hearth licked at the logs, casting dancing, warm shadows on the ceiling beams. Slowly, the flames burned down, collapsing into a bed of glowing, breathing coals. Flint, at their feet, let out a soft whine in his sleep, his tail thumping once on the floor. Outside, the rain fell, a gentle, healing sound on the roof. The window pane, facing the dark valley, grew misty, blurring the world, leaving only the small, warm, safe circle of the firelight. The next morning, the rain was gone. The world was scoured clean. The sun, a bright, powerful thing, was climbing a sky of impossible, aching blue. The air smelled new, as if it had just been created, all damp earth and sharp, living pine. Eli was at the woodpile, splitting logs for the stove, when he saw Cora on the porch. She was not mending. She was just standing, her face turned up to the sun. In her hand, she held the mended blue velvet ribbon. He stopped, his axe resting on the block. He watched her. She looked at the ribbon for a long moment, tracing the new, strong seam with her finger. Then she turned. She did not tie it in her hair. She did not put it around her neck. She walked to the heavy, rough-hewn pine post that held up the porch roof. Deliberately, with steady hands, she tied the ribbon around it, pulling the bow tight. It fluttered in the clean morning breeze, a small, defiant patch of blue against the weathered wood. She turned to Eli, who had walked over, a cup of coffee in his hand. "It is done," she said, her voice quiet, but clear as the morning. "What belonged to the past is now a sign of peace." Eli looked at the ribbon, a mark of her pain, now woven into the very structure of his home. He looked at her, standing in the bright sunlight, her face open and unafraid. The slow, hesitant smile that he so rarely used was gone. In its place, a grin transformed his entire face. an open, unguarded, brilliant expression of pure joy that reached his eyes, making them crinkle. "Cora," he said, his voice full of a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Stay with me." She looked at him, a question in her eyes. "Not because of the storm," he said, taking her hand. "Stay because of the clear sky." The peace that followed the hearing was real, but it was thin. It was the feeling of a clear sky with the knowledge that a storm was building just over the horizon. Voss was gone, but he was not gone. His men still rode the ridges, silent observers. The circuit judge was due in Laramie in a month, and until then, the council's ruling was the only law. Eli and Cora lived in that fragile peace. They worked. Spring had come in earnest, a messy, glorious, muddy explosion of life. They cleared the wreckage of the grain shed, salvaging what timber they could. Eli reforged the bent hinges, his hammer ringing with a new, steady purpose. Cora took the scorched but living seed grain and, with a patience that awed him, began to plant a small, defiant kitchen garden near the cabin. They had found a new rhythm. They were not a rescuer and a victim. They were partners, moving in the easy, unspoken choreography of two people building one life. The cot was moved, placed beside his own. The nights were no longer a vigil, but a rest. The attack came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the hearing. The sky was a high, brilliant blue. Eli was in the forge, sharpening plow blades, the shing-shing of the file a sharp counterpoint to the chirping of the new birds. Cora was hanging laundry on the line, the white sheets billowing in the clean, dry wind. The first sign of wrong was the silence. Flint, who had been sleeping in a patch of sunlight on the porch, was gone. "Flint," Cora called, her hand still on a clothespin. The old hound never wandered. "Flint!" She walked to the edge of the porch. There, in the mud, was a scrap of raw, bloody meat and tracks. Not Flint's tracks, but the tracks of a man's boot, leading away toward the creek. "Eli!" she screamed, her voice high with a new, sudden terror. Eli was out of the forge in an instant, a heavy hammer still in his hand. He saw the meat, he saw the tracks, and his face went white. It was a lure, as if summoned by her scream. A new sound came from the valley, a low, ominous whoosh. Eli's head snapped up, beyond the creek, on the far eastern ridge. A plume of thick, oily black smoke was climbing into the pristine sky. It was the far pasture. It was where he had stacked the entirety of last season's hay, the dry, cured ricks that were vital for the winter to come. He looked at the tracks leading to the creek. He looked at the fire, a mile in the opposite direction. It was a trap. "He has Flint," Eli said, his voice a low, strangled sound. "He set the fire to draw me away." "He is coming for me," Cora whispered, her hands flying to her throat. "Bar the door," Eli said, his voice hard as the iron in his hand. "Do not open it for any man, not even the sheriff. Do you hear me?" "Where are you going?" she cried. "I am going to the fire," he said, his face a mask of agony. "It is the hay, Cora. It is our winter. It is what he wants. He wants to burn us out, or he wants to draw me out. I cannot let him win." "Eli, no, it is a trap. It is all a trap," he roared, a sound of pure frustration. "He thinks I will choose. He thinks I will run to the fire and leave you, or stay and let our future burn. He is wrong." He ran to the porch and grabbed the small, brass whistle that hung by the door. He pressed it into her hand. "If you see him, if you see anyone, blow this, 3 sharp blasts. Do not stop. Mabel and the Finleys will hear. Do you understand?" She nodded, her hand closing around the cold metal. He grabbed 2 wet sacks from the water trough. "Bar the door." He sprinted away, not toward the creek, not toward the dog, but toward the fire. A lone figure running against a backdrop of rising smoke. Cora ran inside. She slammed the door. She dropped the heavy iron bar into place. She ran to the window, her heart hammering so hard it hurt her ribs. She watched Eli grow smaller and smaller, a desperate man running toward a diversion. She was alone. She waited. 1 minute, 5. The only sound was the crackle of the fire, carried on the wind. Then She heard it, the slow, deliberate thud of a heavy carriage pulling into the yard. She peered through the crack in the curtains she had made. It was him. Logan Voss was not on a horse. He was in a fine, black, enclosed carriage, the kind used for long journeys, pulled by two powerful bays. One of his men sat in the driver's seat. Voss himself stepped out onto the ground. He was dressed for travel, a long duster over his suit. He walked to the cabin door. He did not bang. He knocked politely. 3 sharp raps. "Cora," he called, his voice calm, almost pleasant. "The game is over. The circuit judge will be here in a week, and he will not be sympathetic to you. I am offering you one last chance. Come with me now, and I will be lenient." Cora stood in the center of the room, her body frozen, her hand clutching the whistle. "I know you are in there," Voss called. His politeness was more terrifying than his rage. "Do not make this difficult." He waited. He sighed, a sound of theatrical disappointment. "Very well. I had hoped to spare you this." He walked to the side of the carriage and opened the passenger door. "I believe you know this old traitor." He reached inside and dragged out Flint. The old hound was bound, a thick rope tied around his neck as a cruel noose. He was not hurt, but he was terrified, his eyes white, his tail tucked. "He is old, Cora," Voss said, his voice turning cold. He pulled a pistol from his belt. "His heart is weak. I imagine one bullet, even badly placed, would be enough. Now, I am going to count to 3. You will unbar that door, or I will execute your blacksmith's dog on his own porch." He cocked the hammer. The click-click was impossibly loud in the quiet yard. 1. Cora stared, her mind screaming. She saw the gun. She saw Flint, whimpering, his body trembling. 2. Voss raised the pistol, pressing the muzzle to the top of Flint's head. Cora did not unbar the door. She ran to the window, the one facing west, toward the Finley farm. She smashed the glass with her elbow. Not feeling the pain, she stuck her head out and blew the whistle. Shriek, shriek, shriek! The sound was high, piercing, a desperate scream of brass that cut across the valley. Voss, stunned by the sudden noise, flinched. He looked at the window, his face contorting in rage. "Fool!" he screamed. He did not shoot the dog. He grabbed Flint by the noose and threw him, bodily, into the back of the carriage. "Break the door down," he roared at his driver. The driver, a large, brutal man, jumped down and ran at the door, his shoulder hitting the solid oak. The bar held. He hit it again. The wood groaned. Cora kept blowing the whistle, the 3-note blast, over and over. And then, from across the basin, came the reply. A deep, heavy clang, clang, clang. It was the Finley's farm bell. A moment later, from the south, another bell. Clang, 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 the Strouds. The valley was alive. The community was coming. "Get in the carriage," Voss yelled, abandoning the dog. "We are leaving." "The door, boss," the driver yelled, hitting it again. "Forget the door, she has called them. Get me out of here." Voss scrambled into the carriage, and the driver leaped back onto his seat. Grabbing the reins, he cracked the whip, and the heavy carriage lunged forward, thundering out of the yard, turning hard toward the main road, toward the bridge. But Cora was already moving. She did not wait for rescue. She unbarred the door and ran out onto the porch, grabbing the small, sharp skinning knife she kept for the garden. She did not run toward the road. She ran through the trees, her feet flying over the familiar ground, taking the shortcut to the creek. She knew where they had to go. They had to cross the bridge. Eli, on the far ridge, had heard it all. The whistle, the bells. He had seen the carriage tear out of his yard. The fire, which had been a meager, failing pile of hay, was forgotten. He was running, his lungs on fire, taking the high line, his hammer still in his fist. The carriage hit the narrow wooden bridge at a full gallop, the planks rattling. Cora was there first. She had scrambled down the muddy bank and was under the bridge. As the carriage thundered overhead, she grabbed the heavy anchor rope, the main lashing that secured the bridge's side railing to the deep-set foundation post. She sawed at the thick rope with a small, sharp knife. The fibers parted, one by one. The carriage was halfway across when the rope snapped. The side railing, no longer anchored, gave way. The driver, panicked by the sudden shift, pulled the reins too hard to the left. The right front wheel of the heavy carriage went over the unprotected edge. There was a horrific, splintering crack. The carriage did not fall. It foundered, the axle breaking, the wheels shattering. The entire vehicle tilted, groaning, half on the bridge, half in the air, stuck fast. Voss was screaming, trapped inside. The driver was thrown clear, landing in the shallow, muddy creek. Eli arrived, his chest here. He skidded to a halt at the head of the bridge, his hammer raised, blocking the terrified, plunging horses. The driver scrambled up, pulling his own gun. "Stay back! It is over!" Eli panted. From the other side of the bridge, the community arrived. Finley and Stroud, their rifles leveled. Mabel Quinn, her face like thunder. And right behind them, Sheriff Deke Moreland, his horse lathered. He had heard the bells from town and had ridden like the devil. "Voss, get out of that carriage!" Moreland yelled, his gun drawn. The carriage door burst open, and Voss stumbled out, his fine duster covered in mud. He still had his pistol. He grabbed the whimpering, terrified form of Flint, holding the dog in front of him as a shield. "It is a domestic dispute," Voss shrieked, his eyes wild, the mask of control utterly gone. "She is my wife. The law says so." "The law," Eli said, his voice shaking with rage and exertion, "is what you are afraid of." He dropped his hammer. It thudded on the wooden planks. He reached into the deep pocket of his leather apron. "You are a thief, Voss, not a husband," Eli said. He walked forward, his hands empty, open. He held up a small, heavy cloth sack, the same one from the hearing. "The sheriff," Eli said, his voice loud enough for all to hear, "asked for proof." He said a muddy track was not enough. He walked, step by step, until he stood in front of Logan Voss. He held out the bag. "When your men rebuilt the dam, they were clumsy. They dropped these. I found them, buried in the mud, right next to the tracks." He upended the bag. It was not nails this time. It was a dozen heavy, distinctive, square-headed bolts, the kind used to fasten a carriage axle, and two custom-made brass letters, an L and a V, made to be mounted on a carriage door. "The fire was to draw me out," Eli said. "The dog was to control her, and the carriage was to steal her. It is all one crime, and this," he pointed to the ruined, foundered carriage, "is the final piece of evidence. I imagine the axle bolts will match." The sheriff looked at the bolts. He looked at the shattered, tilted carriage. He looked at the dog, the gun, the terrified woman, and the assembled, armed witnesses. It was checkmate. "Logan Voss," Moreland said, his voice devoid of all compromise. "I am placing you under temporary arrest for destruction of property, arson, and, by God, kidnapping, pending the arrival of the circuit judge." Voss looked at the leveled rifles. He looked at Eli. His face, for one moment, crumpled. He had lost. He let the dog fall. Flint yelped as he hit the planks, his leg clearly broken, and scrambled. Dragging himself toward Cora, Voss raised his hands. Cora did not wait. She ran onto the bridge, past the sheriff, past Eli, and fell to her knees beside the whimpering hound. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his fur, a terrible, broken sound rising from her throat, a sob that was half grief, half laughter. Eli came and knelt beside her. He said nothing. He just put his massive, soot-stained hand on her shoulder. She leaned into it, her body shaking. His own eyes were brimming. The resolution came 6 weeks later. The circuit judge, a stern man from Cheyenne, had heard it all. Voss's expensive lawyer could not fight the physical evidence of the bolts, the testimony of Orrin Pike, and the united sworn statements of the entire High Basin. The judgment was swift. The marriage was declared null and void, annulled on the grounds of violence, fraud, and deceit. The community access rights to the High Creek were restored permanently, and Logan Voss was found liable for all damages. ordered to pay full restitution for the grain shed, the seed grain, and the veterinary care for Flint's leg. The final scene played out on the main road. Voss, his property seized in auction to pay the debts, was being escorted from the valley by the sheriff. He was a ruined man, his fine suit rumpled, his hands bound. As they rode past the turnoff to Eli's land, Voss stopped his horse. He looked up at the high creek, where the water now ran free, nourishing the small farms. He saw them, the entire community. Eli and Cora stood at the front, Cora's hand on Flint's head. Behind them were Mabel, and Orrin Pike, and the Finleys, and the Strouds, and Edna Vale. They were not armed. They were not shouting. They were just watching. A silent, united wall of survivors. Voss opened his mouth, a final, poisoned curse on his lips. But he looked at their faces, one by one. He saw no fear. He saw no anger. He saw nothing but the cold, hard fact of their unity. He said nothing. He turned his horse and rode away. As the dust from his departure settled, a sound moved through the small crowd. It was not a cheer. It was a long, collective, shuddering sigh. The high basin, after a year of being held hostage, finally exhaled. It was the sound of a bandage, pulled tight for months, finally being removed from a wound. The valley healed. Summer came to the high basin, not as a guest, but as a resident. The snow, which had been a shroud, was now a distant, white memory on the highest peaks. The land that had been locked in ice was now an explosion of lupine, Indian paintbrush, and tall, sweet grass that waved in the winds. The high creek, fed by the melt, ran fast and clear, a silver artery of life that now belonged to everyone. The sound of Eli's anvil returned to the valley, but it was a different sound. The angry, defiant ringing of the winter had been replaced by a steady, productive rhythm. He was no longer a man forging defenses. He was a man building a future. He mended the plows for the Finleys. He shoed the horses for the Strouds. He fixed the iron on the town well. He took down the old, faded sign that read Mercer Forge. He sanded it smooth, the wood pale and new. Cora found him staring at it, a piece of charcoal in his hand. "What is wrong?" she asked. "It is not just Mercer anymore," he said, his voice quiet. "I did not win that hearing. We did, Orrin, Mabel, the Finleys." Cora smiled. "Then the sign should say so." She took the charcoal from his hand and, in her neat schoolteacher's script, she wrote, "Mercer Forge Friends." Eli looked at the words. A slow grin spread across his face. "And friends." He repeated. He liked the sound of it. He spent the rest of the day carving the letters and painting them black. The new sign, hung high on the forge wall, was a statement of fact. Cora, too, began her work. While Eli worked with iron, she worked with fiber and with mines. She used a portion of the restitution money, the funds Voss had been forced to pay for the destroyed grain, to order slates, chalk, and books from a supplier in Cheyenne. She nailed her own hand-painted sign to the porch of the cabin, needlewood. It read, "In the mornings, she taught sewing and mending to the women of the valley, showing them the honeycomb stitch that was stronger than the original cloth. In the afternoons, she taught reading and letters. Her first students were the children of the railroad workers, families who lived in tents and shanties down by the Laramie line, often forgotten. They were wild, ragged, and suspicious. But they came, drawn by her quiet patience and the smell of the cinnamon rolls she baked. Cora's classroom, held under the shade of the porch, had one absolute rule, which she wrote on the largest slate for all to see. "There will be no harsh hands in this place. There will be no cruel words. You are safe here." She enforced it with the quiet, unbending authority of a woman who knew precisely what a harsh hand and a cruel word could do. She would tolerate no abuse, not of a child, not of an animal, not of a soul. The community, now bound by water and by shared victory, gathered to make their triumph permanent. They met at the high creek, at the spot where the dam had been. Eli, in his forge, built the heavy iron brackets and the wheel mechanism. The Strouds and Finleys, now with full ditches, donated the timber. Together, they built a proper water station. It was not a dam, but a headgate, with a simple, clever wooden wheel that measured the flow, ensuring the share was equal. On the heavy crossbeam, Mr. Abernathy tacked up the new, permanent rules of water use. When the work was done, Eli came back with his heavy punch, the one he used to mark his tools. He heated it in a portable forge until it glowed red. He did not sign his own name. He pressed the hot iron into the wood, one by one, burning the names of the families who had stood together at the hearing: Mercer, Quinn, Finley, Stroud, Pike, Vale. It was a new map of the valley, a new covenant, written not in ink, but in fire. Life found its rhythm. The days were long, filled with the good exhaustion of physical work. The nights were quiet, filled with the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed to explain themselves. One afternoon in late July, Cora came looking for Eli. He was not at the forge. He was not in the garden. She found him down by the creek, under the vast, sheltering canopy of the cottonwood trees. It was the place where he had first kissed her, the clumsy, cold, questioning kiss. He was working, digging post holes. He had set 2 thick cedar posts deep in the earth and was now hanging a seat from them with lengths of new rope. It was a swing, the seat wide and smooth, built for 2. She stood and watched him, her heart full. He finished his work, testing the knots, brushing wood shavings from his hands. He turned and saw her standing there. He seemed, for the first time she had ever known, nervous. He wiped his hands, truly wiped them, on his trousers. He walked over to her. He did not have a speech. He was not a man of fancy words. "Cora," he said, his voice low. He did not kneel. That was not his way. He reached into the pocket of his shirt. He pulled out a simple thong of dark, oiled leather. It was not a ring. It was not gold or silver. Hanging from the leather was a small, intricately carved shape. It was a tiny, perfect horseshoe, carved from a piece of dark, fragrant juniper wood, the wood they had named their first foal after. He had made it in the forge, in the quiet hours after she was asleep, shaping it with a knife and smoothing it with sand until it felt like a polished stone. "I am not a man who understands contracts," he said, his voice rough, "or paper, or law." He held the small, wooden token out to her. "But I am a man of my word, and I am a man who understands iron and wood, and this." He looked at her, his eyes steady and full of a quiet, profound warmth. "I want to build a life with you, Cora, here, by this water we saved, if you will have me." Cora looked at the small, carved horseshoe. It held everything. It was the barn, and the foal, and the forge, and the fire, and the man who had stood on his own floor, guarding her sleep. She did not cry. She smiled, a wide, bright, brilliant smile that she had once thought was lost to her forever. "Yes, Eli," she whispered. "Yes, I will." He did not put it around her neck. He simply pressed it into her hand, and then he took her hand in both of his, and he held it. He led her to the new swing and they sat, his arm settling around her shoulders as if it had always belonged there. He set the swing into a slow, gentle motion. Flint, his leg healed but with a noble, permanent limp, had followed her down. He lay at their feet in the shade, and as they began to move, he let out a single, sharp, happy bark, as if giving his own formal blessing. The wedding was not in a church. It was in the barn, in late August, on a day so clear it hurt the eyes. The community gathered. Eli and Cora had spent a week scrubbing the barn, clearing the stalls, and laying down fresh, sweet-smelling hay. They held it in the very spot where he had found her, a frozen, broken thing in a white dress. Now, that spot was transformed. The railroad children, her students, had spent the morning picking wildflowers, and the old structure was filled with cascades of blue lupine, red paintbrush, and yellow sunflowers. There were no formal pews, just benches from the meeting house and clean blankets on the hay. The entire valley was there. Mabel Quinn, in a fine dark blue dress, the Finleys and the Strouds, their children scrubbed and silent. Orrin Pike, who had overcome his fear, stood tall, and Edna Vale, who had printed the flyers, was writing in her notebook, a smile on her face. Cora did not wear a white wedding dress. She wore a simple, new dress of pale yellow calico, the color of the summer sun. Eli wore his good shirt, the one she had mended. There was no expensive cake. Cora and Mabel had spent the day before baking, and the tables were laden with bread, preserved fruit, and dozens of hot, sticky, fragrant cinnamon rolls. The air smelled of hay, cinnamon, and wildflowers. The laughter of the children, who had discovered the foal juniper in a nearby stall, was the only music. Mr. Abernathy, his face solemn, stood before them. "You have written your own vows," he said. Eli turned to Cora, taking her healed, strong hands in his own scarred, calloused ones. "Cora," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that everyone in the barn could hear. "I promise to stand by you, even when the wind changes. I promise to be your home, and I promise," he said, his eyes holding hers, "to always listen to the things you do not say." Cora's eyes shone, but she did not let the tears fall. She gripped his hands. "Eli," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I promise to be your partner. I promise to always hear you, even when the forge is loud. And I promise to remember, always," she said, her voice catching just slightly, "that neither one of us ever needs permission to start again." Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Then, by the authority of this community and the grace of God, I pronounce you man and wife." The barn erupted, not in polite applause, but in a true, heartfelt cheer. The next morning, Cora was outside. She had painted a new, large, handsome sign to be hung at the entrance to their lane, where the road met the valley. It read, simply, "Mercer Homestead, Est 1889. And beneath it, needleword, "All are welcome." As Eli came to help her hang it, he saw her holding the mended blue velvet ribbon. It had hung on the porch post all summer, faded by the sun, the blue now a soft, pale gray. But the honeycomb stitch she had sewn was as strong as the day she had made it. She did not tie it in her hair. She did not wear it. She reached up and, with steady hands, she tied it to the bottom of the new, heavy sign. It fluttered in the morning breeze. A banner. It was no longer a wound. It was no longer a scar. It was a story, a symbol of hope, tied to the wood that marked their home. At her request, Eli took a small, hot iron from his pocket forge. Beneath the words, "All are welcome," he pressed the iron to the wood, burning in the final line, the rule of their home, the rule of her classroom. You do not need a license to choose kindness. That night, the last night of summer, the air was cool and clear. The sky was a deep, dark velvet, scattered with so many stars it seemed to be breathing light. The first fireflies of the evening were rising from the tall grass, tiny, drifting, golden lanterns. Eli and Cora sat on the swing he had built, his arm around her, her head resting on his shoulder. They moved in a slow, easy rhythm, watching the darkness settle. Flint was asleep at their feet, his paws twitching. The valley was quiet. It was at peace. Eli was silent for a long time, the only sound the soft creak of the ropes and the chirp of the crickets. "I was wrong," he whispered, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. Cora tilted her head, looking up at his profile against the stars. "About what?" "That morning," he said, "after the rain, I asked you to stay because of the clear sky. That was wrong." He looked out at the dark, vast, and beautiful land. "I did not find you. Cora, I did not save you." He turned, his gaze finding hers in the dim light. The storm brought you home." Cora smiled, a soft, secret smile in the dark. She laid her head back down, resting her cheek against the solid, steady wall of his chest. She closed her eyes, listening to the slow, powerful, living beat of his heart. "And we," she whispered, as a firefly landed on the swing's rope, glowing like a small beacon. Built a home right in the middle of it. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with us. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and like this video. And finally, if this story moved you, please support us by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by many more.